We're now going to move on to the next debate, which is on delivering new housing supply, and I call David Davis to move.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. One of the critical issues facing our constituents today is housing. Whether it's young people struggling to get on the property ladder, tenants having to put up with high rents and substandard housing, or families who cannot afford an adequately sized home. Across the political divide, I believe we're all acutely aware of the growing crisis we face. 7 out of 10 voters think that there is a national housing crisis, and housing is a top issue for millennials. After the First and Second World Wars, there were campaigns for homes fit for heroes. I think what we need now is a campaign for homes fit for a new generation. And it's worth pausing here for a second as to reflect on why home ownership is so important. I think all of us believe in the ideal of a property-owning democracy. MPs in every party will understand that buying your first home is a huge milestone in life. We all understand that having your own space, somewhere you can call your home, is incredibly valuable. It gives you a stake in society and a sense you're controlling your own life. Ownership also provides for much greater security than the rental market, which is especially difficult at the moment. Now, it's not right that huge numbers of people, including families with young children, have to keep moving or to be insecure and unable to properly put down roots anywhere. It's bad for all of us, and it undermines our collective sense of community. Now, house prices have now reached unaffordable levels because, fairly evidently, we have a housing shortage. The average home costs about £285,000, and in London, where the picture is even more stark, the average cost is an enormous £523,000. Over the last 25 years, housing affordability has worsened in every single local authority across England. And it's younger people that most acutely feel the impact of the crisis. In my lifetime, the number of young families trying to buy a house has virtually halved. When I first bought a house, the average house cost 3 times the average income. Now it's almost 9 times the average wage, between 8 and 9 times. And in the last decade, over half of first-time buyers have had to rely on some kind of help from their parents. The increasing need to rely on the bank of mum and dad is a widening inequality gap and further eroding social mobility in the United Kingdom. Yet this crisis is forcing those who cannot rely on well-off parents to fork out thousands of pounds more in rent, to stay at their family home for longer, and to delay their plans to start their family. And even those who can afford a home are getting less for their money. Since 1970, the average size of a living room in a new build property has declined by a total of 27%. The average floor space for homes has declined by almost 20% in that time. So not only do we need to build more houses, we also need to build them better. Our constituents deserve and rightly expect both quantity and quality. Now, it's obviously a matter of supply and demand. And let's deal with the demand first off. Since the mid-90s, the nation's population has grown by between 9 and 10 million people, principally because of immigration. And governments of all persuasions, and I'm making this deliberately a non-party matter, governments of all persuasions have failed to build the homes required to meet that increased demand. The result has been a huge backlog in housing need, probably 3 or 4 million. I've seen all sorts of estimates, but probably 3 or 4 million. Clearing that backlog and meeting new annual demand would require us to create several hundreds of thousands of homes every year for decades to come, which all governments, again, have failed to do. Now, on the face of it, the answer is simple. Build more houses. But with our planning system, this is far easier said than done. The real question is not whether to build, the real question is where to build. And not just because the demand is higher in some places than in others. All of us today have run into vested interest groups opposing new build estates. Often these groups can have legitimately held and valid concerns about overdevelopment, the impact on local amenities, infrastructure, or the concreting over of local countryside. we should not, if we want to attack this properly, we should not see NIMBYs as irrational or selfish. Indeed, their feelings are entirely understandable. A home is a significant investment, and probably the most significant investment that every family will ever make. And the so-called NIMBYs quite rightly want their children to grow up in a decent home in a good quality neighbourhood. So if you've moved to a rural or semi-rural area, already facing stretched public services or congested roads, you'll not wish to see your idyllic new home engulfed by rapid and substantial urban sprawl, or to see infrastructure placed under unnecessary or additional stress. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a powerful case, and absolutely right in the way he's laying out the problem and the way that people see it. Is he aware not just of NIMBYism but also YIMBYism, the yes in my backyard movement, which is basically saying many people are willing to accept densification, particularly in British towns, to see more and more investment in town centres breathe life back into those towns, both socially and also economically, and goes with the grain of what people want to see, and also cuts housing costs both to rent and to buy.
And I agree with him entirely. It's slightly separate to the main thrust of the argument I'm about to make, but he's exactly right. I mean, one of the issues is quality of community is addressed directly by what he's just been saying. But how do we get around the NIMBY problem in its conventional sense? Well, I believe the answer is garden towns and villages, or one large part of the answer is garden towns and villages. And this is not a new proposal. It's a tried and tested policy, albeit with some tweaks that can deliver in the 21st century. Indeed, my honourable friend, the member for South Thanet, has spoken about it before. I've spoken about it before. There have been policy exchange think tank papers on it and the like. So it's not that new, but it is worth resurrecting. In the 20th century, the Garden City movement resulted in the creation of towns like Letchworth and Welwyn Garden City, now populated by about 30 or 40,000 people in each case. Those new garden towns and cities were great successes. What's the measure of that? Well, nearly 3 million people live in the 32 towns created under the New Towns Act. So reviving the ideas will, I think, hold the key to solving much of the existing housing crisis. I will give way to
Thank you for making a really fascinating speech, and I hope the debate's going to be of equal quality. There is an issue with density. I think garden cities are a fantastic idea, whether it's Hampstead Garden Suburb, Welwyn Garden City, and the others. But we have some of the lowest density cities in the world, and we are a small country with a high density per kilometre population compared to elsewhere in the world. How does he square that sort of circle with the high quality environment that he wants to see?
Part of it fits in with what our honourable friend said, but I'm going to challenge him on the high density of population here in a moment, and I'll directly deal with that. And let's just hit the politics of NIMBYism for a second. Let's just talk about the politics of NIMBYism. Today, in a village, let's say in my constituency, you add on a small development, and you have 100 home development, will generate thousands of objections. That's what will happen, you know. That's inevitably what happens. A garden town can deliver tens of thousands of homes, and will probably deliver, if you put it in the right place, a few hundred objections, and I'll talk about how we minimise that too. But such a scheme will be fruitless unless we can ensure that new developments generate the funding they need to become places where people actually want to live. That's key to this. Part of the problem with the existing process is that a mass of potential funding for infrastructure can quickly disappear, captured not by the local community, but instead by landowners and developers. As soon as a hectare of farming land gets planning permission, its value will shoot up by roughly 100-fold. That's the sort of order of magnitude. It goes from 21,000 for the average hectare of agricultural land to an enormous average residential land value of 2.1 million. That's outside London, per hectare of land. Yet the vast majority of that will go to the landowner and developers. About 27% is captured by the state, mostly by the Treasury. This is over and above mostly the Section 106 And there's no guarantee that it will be spent locally. Indeed, there's almost a guarantee it won't be spent locally. I'm looking at the Treasury Minister on here on that. This system starves local communities of funding that could pay for necessary infrastructure within the development itself. Schools, roads, train stations, GPs and hospitals, fibre optics, cycle lanes, you name it. Or even funding, and this comes a bit to the density point, even funding that could pay for larger and cheaper homes. The result is a piecemeal development around existing settlements which lacks proper amenities to cope. And the solution lies with that example that I've referred to already, set during the 20th century. The construction of new towns was centred around radical but effective legislation that allowed new town development corporations to buy large tracts of land at their existing use value. This meant that when buying up farmland for these garden towns, the corporations paid the agricultural price rather than the hope value or hypothetical market price. I want to propose a slightly more sophisticated approach because I don't really like expropriation. I'm a conservative, you know. So we're going to have some sort of compulsory purchase, but there should be a proper compensation for that. Consider an example of a 1,000-hectare garden town. That's a little bit smaller than Welwyn Garden City. Purchasing 1,000 hectares of land at agricultural value would cost 21 million. But as soon as it has planning permission, it would rise to 2.1 billion. Remember that number. There's no change to the underlying land value, no land usefulness, and no work undertaken. That's just a change off the back of planning permission. But a government-created garden town development corporation might pay the existing owners, let's say, 10% of the development value. That's still 210 million. That's a pretty rich farmer we're now talking about. 210 million has gone there. 10 times the existing use value. Profit for him of 190 million. But it still leaves 1.9 billion of uncaptured asset value. 1.9 billion of surplus to invest in the town's infrastructure, the schools, the medical centres, the parks, the pedestrian walkways, the high-speed optical links, the road and rail connections. And because it's done as a single entity... yes, I will give way.
I'm very grateful to him. I commend him on securing this debate, and he's making some very important points. Does he agree that part of the success of the new towns was around the provision of social housing, and that there needs to be a substantial programme of that within the programme that he's setting out for the House this evening?
I see nothing difficult, frankly, nothing difficult about that, because what I'm talking about is creating communities which you've designed. Yeah? And when you create the community that you've designed, you're creating all sorts of social structures within it. And I'll come back to the detail in a minute, but there's nothing that he's argued about that I have a problem with. Because, as I say, it's done as a single entity. Unlike the chaotic marginal extensions and infills of current development, we can ensure it's well designed. And we know how to build successful communities. We have plenty of evidence. We know how to design out crime. We know how to separate traffic from pedestrian ways and cycle to school routes. And if we select the locations properly, we can ensure links that facilitate getting to work, shopping and entertainment.
Well, my honourable friend give way.
Of course.
I admire his ambition in looking to achieve these large new towns. I'm going to argue in my remarks that we're probably better off looking at sustainable extensions to existing communities. Well, I admire his ambition, but does he not recognise that we've tried this with eco-towns no more than 20 years ago? Not a single one succeeded, and there was so much opposition that I fear his laudable aims are not going to be realised.
Well, listen to the rest of the argument, is what I'm saying. Because the aim of this is to create a well-designed town, one that's attractive to live in, right? And I've looked around my own part of the world, and I thought, I can see where they would go. And I'm not going to say it publicly, I don't want to change the land values around me, but I can certainly see. Because these developments are built in comparatively low population areas. They won't be on top of an existing town, as he describes. They can, to a very large extent, sidestep the NIMBY problem. Even in cases where there's a hamlet near to a proposed site, we've got a fairly sizable surplus. You could buy out those who are objecting with a small premium on their existing market price, a little bit of help with moving, tax-free and so on, you could actually minimise that NIMBY problem. And it's not as though we're short of space for these new developments. We often hear, and this is the point my honourable friend from the Isle of Wight came up with, we often hear that the UK is full, or that further development risks damaging our beautiful countryside. I mean, such arguments, I'm afraid, he's been in a helicopter more times than I have. If you fly from London to York, or Hereford to York, or wherever you like, you'll look out the window, and unless you're passing over a major conurbation, it's like looking at a golf course, And so only 8.7% of the country is developed. In England, forget Scotland, they're a tiny fraction, but in England alone, only 8.7%. I will give way once more.
Just on the point, but this figure is slightly disputed. Because if you look at motorway service stations, urban lighting, urban sprawl is becoming significantly more than just the 8.7. So 8.7 is a very narrow definition, and there are people who would at least double that definition. But I accept some of the arguments.
Like all mathematicians, as I am, I always treat numbers carefully. And he might note that I said, look out the window of a helicopter. And if you do that, you'll see what I'm talking about. Large amounts of free tracts of land. And I'm not just talking any old land, I'm talking about land near motorways, near railway hubs, near the old beaching railway lines. We want to rebuild some of those. There are a whole series of places you could put these people. And it's not just a numbers game either. As the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, raised and others have raised, new communities need to have a character. They need to be attractive. They need to be attractive to all sorts of society. Garden villages and towns make that possible. Instead of shoehorning, and not necessarily trying to get some other policy aim in, instead of shoehorning new houses in any nook and cranny we can find in existing settlements, we can build good quality, spacious homes in new developments. Spacious homes. I've got to stop there. I'm nearly finished. I'm nearly finished. We can build good quality, spacious homes in new developments. Well-designed homes in well-designed communities. Learning from previous development of garden villages and new towns, we can avoid the past mistakes and build attractive, pleasant places that people will genuinely want to call home. What we're aiming for, this issue is an issue of, in many ways, an issue of property rights. What we're aiming for is the best balance of affordability, ambition and respect for local residents of any mass house building proposal currently on the table. They're based on a proven model of success. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, let's get building.
The question is, as on the order paper, as colleagues will see, this is a very well subscribed debate, and if we're to get everybody in, that requires speeches of, I would say, 7 minutes. Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I begin my comments by congratulating the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Holton, Price and Howden, not just on securing this important debate, but setting out many of the arguments that I hope to advance myself in this contribution. The statistics speak for themselves. More people living with parents for longer, more people private renting, unable to get on the housing ladder, lower rates of home ownership, and adults between 35 and 45 3 times more likely to be renting now than 20 years ago. The system is broken. The symptoms are many, but the root cause always is a lack of housing supply. This is basic supply and demand, and we must take the action needed to address what is a spiralling crisis. Madam Deputy Speaker, I speak out on this issue because I've been there, I understand it, and I know that millions of young people are suffering because we are not building enough homes. In short, Madam Deputy Speaker, my lived experience makes me, as the Honourable Gentleman for Weston-super-Mare would call it, a YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard, pro-housing, pro-development, cognizant of the economic potential that house building brings. I want to see us build it now. Build it all. Social, affordable, unaffordable even. All can play their part in tackling the housing crisis. So what must we do to get things moving? Well, quick wins to deliver more housing supply would include the restoration of mandatory housing targets to at least the 300,000 figure previously committed to by this government, and ideally more. But beyond overarching targets, we must also stand by the requirement for councils to show a 5-year supply of land and ensure that local plans are still required to be evidence-based and open to challenge from a planning inspector. Failure to do so allows local authorities up and down this country to consistently underprovide if they wish to. That is a scandal, and to enable it would be an abdication of the basic duty of this government to provide a safe and secure home for all. And what of new ideas to improve housing delivery? Well, we should give urgent consideration to the introduction of a builder's remedy where no credible local plan exists. If a local authority is unwilling to play its part in tackling the national housing crisis, central government must step in and compel them to do so. A builder's remedy isn't new. It's been around in the US since the early 1980s, when the Californian state legislature passed the Housing Accountability Act. Such a measure in the UK would ensure local authorities agree a compliant housing element within their local plan documents. If they didn't do so, they would have their development controls restricted and development not just centrally determined, but determined under far less stringent requirements. Give way.
There may be something in what he's saying, but in a planning appeal in Goring, in my constituency, the inspector said, even if every bit of grass in the whole constituency or town were built on, the council still couldn't meet the government's theoretical target. That would mean no green gaps at all between habitations. Would he allow exceptions to his general proposal, please?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. What I would say is that this is a multi-layered and complex process. I'm not certain that I would be looking at questions such as housing density and other flexible options that we could use to look to deliver this, alongside broader reforms of the planning system, because as well as the supply of land, if we are credibly to tackle the housing crisis, we must look at planning reform, and I will turn to that momentarily. So those are the quick wins, including a builder's remedy, but what of the sustainable long-term changes needed to effectively plan for greater housing delivery? There are two key elements: reforming the planning system and increasing the supply of land. On planning reform, we must accept that our 76-year-old discretionary planning system is not fit for purpose. The Land and Country Planning Act 1947 should be scrapped. It is stymieing development. Perfectly acceptable applications are rejected on the flimsiest of grounds if there is local opposition, often coming from those making their feelings known from the safety and security of a comfortable home of their own. So what should replace it, Madam Deputy Speaker? We must shift away from a discretionary system to one that is rules-based, underpinned by a flexible zoning code, determined nationally for local implementation. Land would be allocated for certain uses, and if a compliant application for the usage deemed appropriate for that land was received, it would be automatically approved. Clear, fair, even-handed and efficient.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend's making a fascinating speech. He makes a very powerful case. Does he agree that as part of reforming the planning system, it's important to consider encouraging developers to build on existing brownfield sites within towns and cities, many of which are very large and could contain a large amount of housing, and many English towns and cities have relatively low density and a lot of brownfield land?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend on that point. I am in no way opposed to increasing density and indeed unlocking the more than 1 million homes that currently have planning permission on brownfield sites, but this alone does not resolve the issue, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are short, compared to our European neighbours, some 4.3 million homes per capita, so there is more to do than simply increasing density on brownfield land alone, although there is significant potential there, potentially up to 1.5 million additional units. But of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, even a reformed planning system needs adequate land supply, and there are fewer thornier issues than this. But the fact is, whatever the density, whatever the tenure type, whichever way you cut the cake, there are not enough brownfield sites in urban areas to meet our housing need. We have to be honest about that. And we fail future generations when we are not. It is for this reason that I believe that we must now look to the Greenbelt for additional land capacity. So one option would be to bring forward brownfield land within the Greenbelt for development, as my colleagues on the opposition front bench are currently proposing. I would support that in a heartbeat. But another more radical option, and the Right Honourable Gentleman in his opening comments alluded to this through the use of garden cities, would be to say that all Greenbelt land within 1 mile of a commuter railway station and not subject to any other protections could be brought forward for housing. Such a move could deliver between 1.9 and 2.1 million homes in those locations where people actually want to live, on the outskirts of major conurbations, with the connectivity to take advantage of all this offers. But that point about protections is important too, because with either of these options, national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, sites of special scientific interest, green spaces with protections would be left untouched, our genuine natural beauty preserved, rather than the artificial construct that is the green belt. In truth, less a green belt, more an urban choke. So that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is how we should drive delivery of new housing, testing housing targets, 5-year land supply, sound local plans and a builder's remedy now, planning reform, flexible zoning and strategically managed building on the green belt in the long term. None of this is easy. But if we are to tackle generational inequality, uphold the promise that each generation should do better than the last, deliver rapid economic growth and ensure everyone has access to a safe and secure home of their own, we must meet this challenge regardless. We have a unique opportunity to side with the builders, not the blockers, to truly start planning for growth. I am, and always will be, proudly Labour and proudly YIMBY, but proudest of all that it is clear now to see that a Labour government will respond to this unprecedented challenge and deliver the new housing our country so desperately needs.
Just a reminder of my advice about 7 minutes, because it is going to squeeze others if we don't stick to that. I'm sure Kit Malthouse will be a brilliant example. Kit Malthouse.
Do my best, Madam Deputy Speaker. I draw attention to my entry in the register, tangential though it may be, and I congratulate the honourable gentleman on a speech, much of the contents of which I agreed with. 4 years ago or so, when I was housing minister, I decided to hold a housing summit in my largely rural constituency, 220 square miles of rolling, beautiful Hampshire downland. It's largely in AONB. And about 150, should we say, more senior members of society showed up to a village hall. And it was quite obvious from the outset that I was heading for a beating. So I started my remarks by posing 2 questions to the gathered group. I asked them, first of all, to put their hands up if they had a child or a grandchild over 25 still living at home. And about half the room did so. I then asked them to put their hand up if they bought their first home in their 20s. About 2/3 of the room put their hands up. Having posited the problem, Madam Deputy Speaker, we then went on to have quite a civilised conversation about where houses should be going in my constituency, and indeed much of the South East, for they had come from far and wide. And in truth, the message to those people who are resistant, who are nervous about housing development, even to those small number possibly of verifiable NIMBYs amongst us, is that whether they like it or not, the houses are coming. Because a generation that's been denied access to housing will eventually come of age and be able to vote to put those houses in place for councils and councillors and members of parliament and governments who will deliver what they were denied. And we should learn a lesson, by all means, yes.
How many sites have been allocated following that meeting?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to say that my constituency overall is forecast to take something like 30,000 homes over the next 10 years or so. And while there's some questions to be asked about where the houses are going and what they're going to look like, those are fundamentally the only two questions that we have to ask. So we're building a lot. And indeed, I hope over the next 10 years that Andover, the main town in my constituency, will get close to double the size it has been in the past. But this is not just, Madam Deputy Speaker, a problem for those individuals who are denied housing. It's a problem for the nation as a whole, and we can see the impact of restrictions on housing and inability to access housing elsewhere. In the United States, for example, there is a brain drain taking place from the major cities, major coastal cities, San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., as young, highly productive people who can't access housing are leaving in large numbers. Now, in this country, we may see that spreading to other parts, but of course, because we're a smaller country geographically, we'll see other impacts. So we've seen lower household formations over the last 20 years than we have before. We've seen a declining birth rate, and of course, more and more young people choosing to live and work overseas. And the history of human economic achievement, Madam Deputy Speaker, has shown us that the closer we gather together, the more we crowd together, the more productive we are and the more innovative we are. And so there's going to be a long-term impact for us overall, economically as well as individually. Now, how do we deliver those houses? I don't think anybody thinks that we shouldn't be delivering 300,000 houses today. When I was Housing Minister, I had a church totaliser on my whiteboard showing me where those houses were going to come from and how we were going to get there. And for me, I think there are broadly three things we need to do. First of all, on the planning system. The planning system has long been a kind of obsession of wonkery. That somehow it needs to be swept away because it's not working. And yet local authorities will tell you that 92% of applications are approved that go through, that actually it's functioning. But they do express a frustration with it, which is that the system as it's currently configured has become a huge game of poker. Both developer and councillor and local people are gambling with what is going to happen with somebody in a suit or otherwise whatever, suit, male or female, from Bristol. The planning inspector will be the final croupier that decides who wins this game of poker. And that's just not good enough. As the Honourable Member for Stretford and Urmston says, certainty is what produces results. And so, for me, the first step is the abolition of the planning inspectorate, alongside hard targets on local authorities, but an absolute right for them democratically to choose where those houses should go in their area. Now, hopefully that's brownfield. Some of it may indeed be garden villages, and it's a great sadness to me that the Oxford-Cambridge ARC seems to have been abandoned by the government. I had huge ambitions for that part of the world. But if you create certainty, if you put local authorities in charge with those hard targets, knowing that they've got their own fate in their own hands, then we can just get on and build. The second element of the planning system which needs to be removed, in my view, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the viability test. Many developers over-densify, they hide behind the viability test, they do the local community out of its rightful contribution from the uplift in value because they show a spreadsheet of whether the development's going to make money or not, and they justify adjustments here and there. This is particularly the case in London, where you simply cannot overpay for land. What the viability test says that if you've overpaid for land, you can just build a 44-storey skyscraper, and that will pay for your effective overpayment and largesse. If you get rid of the viability test, so you get actual market in land, it is possible to overpay, then you'll see realistic values, I think, and more land coming through. And then finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the key elements, I think, for the acceptance of housing in local areas, and I see this certainly in my constituency, alongside the need for the restoration and the strengthening of neighbourhood planning, is a very strong sense of aesthetics. I've joked in the past that if they would only build thatched cottages in my constituency, we'd build thousands of the damn things. Right? That aesthetics matter. And when you look at some of our historic towns and cities, they have been scarred by previous generations, building rubbish stuff. Right? The houses that were built in the 60s and 70s have largely been, or will be in the future, bulldozed and replaced. Nothing of that era will be deemed, or hardly anything will be deemed to be a conservation area, as so much of the mass development created by the Victorians is today. And if we can get aesthetics right, then you will find that acceptability will rise, along with the certainty that local people know that they are in charge of their destiny on housing. And you can look at examples of this around. If you ever go have the joy, to go to Stamford in Lincolnshire, I didn't actually mention to the honourable member for Stamford that I was going to mention this, but if you go to Stamford in Lincolnshire, you can see a game of two halves. You will find developments there in a classical tradition that looks like Stamford, and where people queue round the block to buy those houses. And on the other side of town, you will see developments that look like the same old rubbish that's built anywhere else in the UK, that has scarred that beautiful town for many generations to come. So if we can have a rigid aesthetic code looking at vernacular architecture, put local authorities in charge and not have this arbitrary decision by the planning inspectorate, and get rid of the artificially inflated land values through the abolition of the viability test, along with some hard numbers that add up to 300,000 a year, possibly more, as the honourable gentleman said, then I think we stand a chance of doing exactly as he said, which is answering the question that we have to answer for the next generation, which is, will their life be better than ours? And if we can do that, the answer may well be yes.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's good to follow the member for North West Hampshire. I think I agree with everything he said, the points that he has made. Public housing supply across Northern Ireland is where I, however, wish to focus some of my brief comments. We do have a chronic undersupply of homes across the country. Now, in terms of public supply, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive remains the largest public housing organisation, I believe, in Europe, not just across the United Kingdom. And it does, by and large, a fabulous job under very, very difficult circumstances. And it used to be an organisation that managed some of the largest single housing estates across Europe. Many of those estates, of course, were sold off, and some of them were bulldozed because they were not effective or efficient, and we therefore now have a resulting impact of those decisions taken when we do not have a good supply of public housing. And unlike other public housing authorities, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive has a statutory duty to meet need for the homeless when they present as homeless. This is difficult enough under normal UK circumstances for housing, but in Northern Ireland, from time to time, community tensions flare up that puts additional pressures on public bodies, not least the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. For example, last year we had a feud between certain sections of the community. That internecine dispute between rival groups and organisations impacted on people's lives. Threats were levelled at people, people were put out of their homes, and that crisis became a real problem going into a particular weekend during the year. That crisis weekend, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive had on its books five properties across the whole of Northern Ireland that it would have been able to give to people if they presented as homeless. Little wonder we have a housing accommodation emergency in Northern Ireland. And that's 5 properties for the entirety of Northern Ireland, not just to deal with that particular one-off situation of a feud, but to deal with also all of the other problems presented with regards to the lack of supply of housing. At some time, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive had to deal with other routine housing need. Levels of homelessness are hidden from sight more in Northern Ireland than anywhere else. Indeed, in post-pandemic, these levels of homelessness have been exposed, and the opportunity to sofa surf at a relative or a friend's house is no longer available. However, properties are now nowhere near the level to meet the need, despite the fact that the Northern Ireland Housing Executive is still the largest provider of public housing. The figures are significantly. Pre-pandemic demands for temporary accommodation in Northern Ireland, a marker for homelessness, have soared from 3,000 placements in 2019 to 9,000 placements last year. And in fact, this week I got new figures from the Housing Executive and will probably exceed the 10,000 mark this year. These are the most up-to-date figures which the Housing Executive presented to me in recent days. As an elected official for more than 26 years, I've worked very closely with the Housing Executive. They are an amazing organisation, staffed with great people who care, but they are struggling to meet very intense need, which must be addressed by a new strategy. Locally, for example, in my constituency, the Mid and East Antrim Council area, which is not coterminous with all of North Antrim, but at least gives a sample of what the Northern Ireland Housing Executive is up about. In November, December of last year and January of this year, 438 people presented as homeless. 252 of them were made offers of temporary accommodation, and the rest could not be facilitated. Now, that's approximately 3 families per day presenting in one part of my constituency, and the biggest public provider of housing does not have stock available to them because it is just not there. This is not sustainable, and radical action is required to fix it. On an average across Northern Ireland, households stay in temporary accommodation for up to 32 weeks. Across North Antrim, the average is thankfully lower. Mid and East Antrim area, about 16 weeks, and the Causeway Coast area, about 14 weeks. But it still is a massive problem, and there's so much reliance on private landlords who themselves are working in a squeezed marketplace as well. The knock-on impact of migration and immigration has had an impact on Northern Ireland housing need also. Northern Ireland is pulling its weight with both refugees and migrants proportionately, doing more in fact than some parts of Scotland. But the impact on availability of housing and temporary housing accommodation has been challenging. Hostels, hotels have now become a Home Office policy. We're regularly filled by long-term contracts for migrants and refugees and are not available for the Indigenous housing or homeless need. In the Mid and East Antrim Council area again, a number of hotels are now full-time occupied, and so availability for urgent temporary accommodation has gone. I would like to ask that the Housing Executive be given 2 special measures to assist in 2 ways. First of all, that they're permitted to buy back stock and add to their asset base, including being permitted to buy no longer used nursing homes or hotels and other facilities to start to address the 10,000 people who require homes. Secondly, I would like them to be able to borrow money to engage the market instead of having to fight in a buoyant housing market where one hand is tied behind their back while housing associations are not restricted in the same way. The Northern Ireland Housing Executive being allowed to borrow money would allow them to compete on a fair basis. The Housing Executive invests hundreds of millions of pounds a year into housing stock each year. It is regularly the choice for tens of thousands of people in Northern Ireland to have a happy, settled, good standard home. But in the modern era, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive must be able to invest, to improve and to compete. At the end of this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do not expect the front bench to be able to address all of these issues. But I don't want to hear, and I know I won't hear from the Minister, I respect it greatly, any platitudes that I would hear probably if I was addressing this to the Northern Ireland office. And that, just get a government sorted out in Northern Ireland, this will all be sorted out. None of the issues that I have requested require a Northern Ireland government to be in place. They require the Housing Executive to be liberated to do the things that I have asked. And I would encourage the Minister to speak to her Cabinet officials and encourage our Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to push for these issues to be addressed, to allow the Executive to borrow money and to allow them to buy back stock of housing. Otherwise, this housing crisis in Northern Ireland will deepen. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Andrew Lure.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you to my right honourable friend, the Member for Helton, Price and Howden, for securing this debate today on what's such a pressing and important topic, something I've been involved in one way or another for 20 years at elected office now. And indeed, I was pleased to lead a debate in Westminster Hall on the related topic of the future for SME house builders just the other week. And this debate provides a welcome opportunity to hammer home some of the points I made then. As a Conservative, the idea of the UK as a property-owning democracy is one I feel very strongly about, and it worries me deeply that for many younger people, home ownership is increasingly out of reach. Unsurprisingly, given my chairmanship of the APPG for SME house builders, I've got a strongly held view that it's this sector that can play an incredibly important role in helping to address the dual problems of housing accessibility and affordability across the UK. The Home Builders Federation reports that in 2020, the SME house building sector delivered about 22,000 homes. And to put that into context, according to the Federation of Master Builders, SME builders could deliver 65,000 homes by 2025, compared with 12,000 in 2021, given the right conditions. For those who aren't aware of how vital the SME sector is to housing delivery, let me explain. SME developers typically carry out smaller developments built on trickier sites, and the SME sector tends to go where volume house builders cannot. And as well as this, they often face less vocal opposition as they're delivering brownfield housing up and down the country every day, instead of large-scale developments that often don't have the infrastructure to go along with it, and is responsible for so much so-called NIMBYism. And yet this is a sector that in the late 80s delivered 39% of all homes built in England, and yet 40 years later barely manages 10% of our annual housing completions. The rising costs of materials is producing difficulty for developers across the board, and that's why I welcome initiatives such as that developed by Travis Perkins, who are based in my Northampton South constituency, which means that SME house builders can access building supplies and materials directly without having to face lengthy pre-approval checks. And another issue is SME house builders' access to finance, which my APPG is soon to deliver a report on. And that includes difficulties via the land registries process for recording changes of ownership of properties. And another is labour shortages, obviously crucial to the whole process. Perhaps most importantly, yes?
I'm grateful to him. It's an extremely important point to recognise that small house builders, who were largely wiped out in the crash of 2007-8, have not re-emerged. Does he think that the government should look at the generation of new house builders? So in the 70s we had Laurie Barrett and the chap behind Red Row Homes who built these big house builders, in the same way that they're looking at the generation of new scientists and new companies that promote science and technology, which have a strategy all of their own and funding all of their own. But I have yet to see anything that would stimulate those kind of new companies into the future. Does he agree that that would be something the government could look at?
I think it's a very important point, and indeed we did a report with the APPG on Homes England, where a suggestion of a Homes England for SME house builders to try and address those points was made. So the planning system, of course, has already been touched upon in the debate, and I'm on the record already, and I'm going to say it again. Having the system for house building that we have, but then removing national binding housing targets from it, is a mistake. And when the history of this government's written, it will loom larger than it already is. It's a mistake. A different way was available, and that was via the, if not zonal, then some way towards zonal planning systems reset, as referenced by the Honourable Member for Stretford and Urmston. This administration is probably out of time now for anything radical like that, but other options exist. I've come to understand that the issue of planning relates to planning officer caseload as well, as one town planner said to me. Whilst a 20-unit brownfield developed by an SME is likely to require less work than a 400-unit greenfield development built by a volume house builder, it's not going to require 20 times less work, and therefore SME house builders are disadvantaged through the planning process. Process, yes, indeed, the explosion of process is a speech in itself. We therefore have an entire sector that can help, but is blocked in so many ways. My right honourable friend in his opening speech has touched upon migration in detail. 8 million. It's on us as national politicians whether we supported that unsustainable level or not. I didn't, but it doesn't matter. A national solution of greatly increased house building is absolutely essential. And so, to conclude, ideas are flowing. My right honourable friend, as instigator of this debate, has made insightful and challenging points in favour of garden towns and cities. Then there are the ideas in the Bacon Review, an impressive and important piece of work led by my honourable friend, the member for South Norfolk, and commissioned by the government themselves, now in need of implementation, and it's about self-commissioning, not just self-build. Ideas around building up from my honourable friend for Weston-super-Mare, adding stories, not high-rises, which I was interviewed about on Times Radio recently, plus the work of my honourable friends from Milton Keynes North, for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, and other fellow members along with me in the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, as I wish it was still called. It may be something of a cliché to say that many of our people will only truly believe in capitalism if they have a piece of capital of their own. But as Terry Pratchett once wrote, the reason that clichés become clichés is that they are the hammers and screwdrivers in the toolbox of communication. Thank you, Madam Deputy.
Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to participate in this debate, which has been eloquently opened by the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden. And there's been some fantastic contributions right across the House so far. Housing, I know we all agree with this, right across the House, should be a basic human right that's safe, secure and genuinely affordable, whether that's to rent, private rented sector, social sector, or indeed whether that's to own. Yet in Britain today it's simply not available to all. It's simply not the case. Far too many are homeless. We have over 100,000 families in temporary accommodation. Hundreds of thousands are trapped in the building safety crisis. Many in a tenure called leasehold, which of course should be a feudal relic of the past, yet it's still alive and kicking in England and Wales. And they're actually classed as homeowners, and we know in reality they're not. They have less rights than homeowners. In fact, you've got more rights if you purchase a toaster than if you are a leaseholder, which is an unfortunate fact, which many across this chamber have spoke again eloquently on. We've got 1.2 million people in housing need now, genuine housing need, and the fundamental issue here is lack of housing supply. With the right mix, in the right places, with the right tenure. I'm fundamentally going to focus on public housing. I think the Honourable Member from Antrim referred to this earlier on, because without public housing or social housing being a fundamental part of the mix, we'll never meet what should be a consensus figure, around 300,000. I know some have been more ambitious, 350,000. But if we look back in history, you know, whether we kind of the 1940s, 1950s, 60s, and indeed 70s, we had around 90,000, 100,000 social houses built. Whether that be a Labour administration or a Conservative administration, it must be a fundamental part of the mix. History's staring us in the face there, and yet we look at the current figures. Last year alone, it was minus 14,000. When you take into account right to buy and demolition, just 7,400 were built. And if we map things forward over the next 5 years, it's just 6,400, even less than that pitiful figure of 7,400 last year over the next 5 years. So how do we achieve this? I mean, I do concur with the concept of garden cities, garden towns. I'm the son of Wythenshawe, which was the largest council estate in Europe, but very much thanks to the likes of Lord and Lady Simon in history. So I've seen the impacts that I can make. People have gardens for the first time, beautiful gardens, well-built social housing in its day. So we certainly need greater intervention, regardless of what political party we have in power. I've certainly no faith, and people won't be surprised across the benches opposite from me, as in regards to the current government, to deliver that scale, because the last 13 years has demonstrated that's not going to be the case. But we need that bold transformation, that intervention in the housing market. I would use the right to buy subsidy to actually direct that to the First Homes Initiative. I actually think that's a good idea. It's something which I know that John Healey, MP, has proposed in the past, the former shadow housing secretary. I think it's a great idea, but it's not resourced properly. In fact, there's only 35 homes, First Homes, built last year. There was a target of 10,000. Again, you know, an overpromise and lack of delivery there. It's a good idea in principle, so why not let's use that subsidy in a more creative way? Why not use the £23 billion a year, which is spent on a dysfunction in private rented sector at the moment, in housing benefit, again, to build genuine affordable social housing, and indeed garden cities as well. Interject that way in regards to Homes England, or whatever it may be called in the future, a government agency. There's too many people, young people in particular, have had the drawbridge pulled up from under their feet in regards to, it could be home ownership, or indeed to rent at an affordable rate in a safe, secure home. The only way to do this in the future is actually for everybody right across the political persuasion to be bold, to show leadership in their communities, when you will have sometimes actually quite genuine concerns about lack of infrastructure in what we might class as cowpack communities with, I know the former housing minister referred to some shoddy build that we've got there in states right across the country. That's undoubtedly the case. So let's build something beautiful in the future. Let's kick that drawbridge down and let's have opportunities for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank
you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Halton Press and Hyde, in bringing this really important debate forward, in which I want to draw on the experiences of my constituency in Rugby, where we're doing our part to deliver new housing at scale. And I also want to talk about the challenges in delivering new homes and delivering the infrastructure which is needed alongside residential development, and very often the reasons why people don't like development in the first place. In Rugby, we've got an exemplar of high-quality infrastructure-led development at Halton on the eastern side of the town. It's a sustainable urban extension to the town of Rugby, which has been master planned by the developers Urban and Civic, and once complete will boast roughly 6,000 homes, 4 schools, a district centre, transport connections by both road and rail, and a variety of leisure, retail and community spaces. It's been developed on a brownfield site, previously home to the famous Rugby radio mast site that was clearly visible from the M1 motorway. And the Halton development pays tribute to this history, as the first transatlantic message from the United Kingdom to the US was broadcast from that site to the town of Halton in Maine. And one interesting fact is that by the time the new community at Halton is complete, it will have a population significantly bigger than that of its namesake, and is also, I understand, a unique example of a place in the UK taking its name from a location in the US rather than the other way around. But an important part of getting that development underway is bringing communities along and support to those proposals. And back in the noughties, and when I was a councillor on Rugby Borough Council, very extensive community engagement was done to understand the concerns of neighbouring communities to this site, which we now know as Halton, particularly in the areas of Hillmorton and the village of Clifton upon Dunsmore, to alleviate the concerns that residents nearby might have. Technology was used, Madam Deputy Speaker, to provide computerised effects of what the new development would look like, to take out the uncertainty factor, the fear that people had of what might be having there. And I know that that technology has advanced in recent years and should be used on all occasions to give people a clear idea of what the development is going to look like. But very often people are bothered that when the new homes are built, the roads, schools and health provision will come afterwards. Now, at Halton, the local authority, Rugby Borough Council, Warwickshire County Council and the developer have worked together to bring forward infrastructure at an early stage. The road access, a link road between the new development and Rugby's town centre, was delivered very early with a financial loan from Homes England, and that's enabled traffic to flow in and out of Halton without having to go through the community of Hillmorton, who might have reasonably objected to this new development. The developers themselves have brought forward an outstanding educational provision, building a secondary school around the historic radio station, which was the one that we said broadcast around the world. the design is of such quality that it beat Battersea Power Station in a competition about the reuse of original buildings. And we've got a primary school that opened 4 or 5 years ago. And the development is a respect for the area and giving the investment to bring something at scale. One area where, however, we have encountered difficulty in a component of infrastructure is development of health services. And here I'd like to contrast the difference that I've experienced in dealing with different agencies and bodies. The Department for Education, Homes England, alongside Warwickshire County Council, demonstrated great flexibility in bringing forward the road and the education provision. But regrettably, the health service and the network of bodies and boards and bureaucracies that support it have proved to be very inflexible. There's an intention for an 8GP surgery as part of the district centre in Holton, but we are nowhere near getting any agreement to have that provided. And I hope that as we continue this vital debate today, ministers will engage with these other bodies to ensure that infrastructure gets delivered on time. Now, the Honourable Member for Halton Priest and Harding made a good case for garden cities, for additional totally new communities. But we've been down that road. It hasn't happened. And I think that the sustainable urban extension to existing sites is really the only way we're going to practically achieve anything like the volume of housing that we need. And of course, expanding an existing community has a wider economic benefit, particularly in respect of our town centres, many of which are struggling as people have bought more and more online. And I was very pleased to hear from the member from North West Hampshire that one of his communities is going to be added to, so that it will be double its existing size. It is always going to be easier to expand an existing community. And I do believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that central government has a role to play in encouraging local authorities to take a proactive and pro-sustainable approach to development. If government fails to properly require planning authorities to build the new homes, we won't see the significant progress that everybody in this chamber today, I think, wants to happen. We must encourage our local authorities, and there are authorities who will do it. Rugby's developed that, done that, to develop clear and comprehensive local plans which set out in detail where the development should take place. My real concern is that in withdrawing the targets and making them advisory, we've created a charter whereby development is constantly stymied by the loudest voices who often oppose development. Thank you.
Helen Morgan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and welcome the debate today and congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden for securing it. I think everybody's in agreement that we have a housing crisis and that young people in particular deserve an opportunity to buy a decent home for themselves, or at least rent one at an affordable price which is of a decent and habitable standard. The proportion of people renting in the UK has grown substantially since the mid-90s, from 29% to 35%. And in tandem, more people are paying a higher proportion of their salary to rent their homes. Shelter UK has estimated that private renters are spending over 30% of their income on rent. Finding a good quality home at a fair price has become a never-ending task for some people. There's a general consensus that we need to deliver around 300,000 new homes every year to overcome this crisis, but despite successive government's efforts, it hasn't been achieved since the 1950s, and we should ask ourselves, why is that? Now, it seems like an obvious question, but much of the debate and the issue focuses on planning and indeed on blaming the NIMBY. But if we look at the numbers, we can see that planning isn't the key driver behind the shortfall, and in fact, building is. In the last 6 years, we've granted planning permission for an average of just over 300,000 homes per year. 80%, or possibly more, of planning applications were granted last year. And while I would agree that the process needs to be streamlined, that's not the reason that the homes aren't being built. So what is the reason? The first reason is to do with profitability. Developers build at a rate that the local market can absorb without depressing prices, because obviously they need to make a profit on their activities, and that is quite reasonable. Another reason is capacity in the industry. We don't suffer high rates of unemployment in the construction industry, in fact quite the opposite. In the absence of thousands of construction workers sitting about with nothing to do, the simple reality is that it's not possible for us to build 300,000 houses a year without an informed strategy to train and retain the workers required to deliver them. Now, it's also important to consider the type of housing that we want to be built. We need, urgently, affordable housing. But developers make most money from larger, more expensive homes, and that worsens the shortage of affordable housing. I'm sure we've all got examples in our own constituencies of developments locally with affordable housing quotas being specified as conditions of the planning permission, only for them to be significantly watered down on the basis of commercial viability as that development progresses. So the result is that the least well-off in society are bearing the brunt of the housing crisis because it's at its most acute in the affordable and indeed the social rented sectors. Here again, demand is outstripping supply, often forcing people to live in cramped and unsuitable temporary accommodation while they await their chance to be allocated a property from the housing register. Overall, the National Housing Federation has estimated that there are around 8.5 million people in England with some form of unmet housing need. It's putting huge pressure on the private rental market, keeping rents unaffordably high and preventing many young people from saving for a deposit with which they could buy their first home. But I'd like to focus my attention specifically on the provision of social housing and especially social housing in rural areas. And I'd also like to say that I broadly agree with the member for Weaver Vale in his comments on social housing. The National Housing Federation estimates that 4.2 million people would benefit from a social housing solution, that 145,000 additional affordable homes need to be built each year, including 90,000 for social rent, and that's just to meet the current need for social housing in England. Despite this, last year just 60,000 new affordable homes were built and a mere 7,500 were built or acquired for social rent. Put simply, these are astonishing statistics. However, based on my constituents' experiences, they are not surprising. A lack of affordable and social housing is a particular issue for rural constituencies like mine in North Shropshire. The All-Party Group for Rural Business, of which I am a member, has estimated that 175,000 people are on rural housing lists at present, with homelessness increasing, especially among young people. Rural homelessness may be invisible, but it's been estimated at about 24% in the last year in a study commissioned by English Rural. With average house prices in rural areas standing at 8.6 times higher than in urban areas, this isn't very surprising. Only 11% of annual affordable housing delivery is built in rural areas, and this figure is falling. For every 8 homes sold through the Right to Buy policy in a rural area, only 1 has been replaced. Overall, only 8% of rural housing stock is affordable, compared to 19% in an urban area. So this doesn't just deprive people of the basic need of a home, it creates a barrier to the rural economy, causing businesses to struggle to recruit the quality workforce they need to survive. So in short, we need more affordable and socially rentable homes, and we especially need them in rural places. The impacts of this deficit on social housing are pretty depressing. Many people waiting for social housing are forced into the private rented sector, where the homes are often inappropriate, insecure and really expensive. They're also pushing up demand and average rent, working to inflate the demand for housing benefit. Alternatively, those waiting on the housing register are often housed in so-called temporary accommodation, often rooms in bed and breakfasts, hotels or shared houses. Even in my constituency, I found that they can be unsuitable and even hazardous solutions to the lack of available social housing, and that housing register applicants live in them for far longer than a period you and I would consider to be temporary. Of course, the lack of this housing comes at a substantial social cost. Shelter have estimated that of the nearly 100,000 households living in temporary accommodation, over 25% live outside of the local authority area they previously lived in. So these people are not only suffering the threat of homelessness, the only chance they have of being offered a roof over their head involves moving away from their place of work, critically their support networks, often childcare, and their children's schools. For a family already suffering the threat of homelessness, this intensifies an already incredibly tough situation. In my constituency, I see families waiting lengthy amounts of time to be provided with a house, and a lot of casework regarding the quality of social housing. I've got a family of 7 in a 2-bedroom house, unable to find something more suitable despite giving priority status. I've got a woman whose mental health is at rock bottom, having been placed in a B&B for months on end. And I've got a family with a disabled child, unable to find a home with step-free access. I've got, as most of us have, constituents struggling with mould and damp in council housing and local authority housing, which instead of being treated has just been given a new extractor fan. One constituent has a disabled child and another suffering from asthma. Now, we all agree that this property is not adequate to meet their needs, and these are just a few examples I've picked out from my casework. We need to go further, and we need to build at least 150,000 new homes for social rent per year, delivered by empowering local authorities to commission the housing that they need, with an independent inspectorate assessing their assessment of that need. In the few moments I have left, I'd just like to say that I noted at the beginning of my speech, none of this can be delivered without training the workforce needed to deliver it. So I think we agree about the need to increase the housing supply with the right homes in the right places, but social housing has got to be a key element of delivering that. We need to empower local authorities to put those homes where they are needed, and we need to see a coherent workforce strategy to be able to build them.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I think this is a very important debate. Oh, sorry.
Civic. No, it is you.
Oh, sorry.
Deputy Mayor.
Deputy, sorry, I do apologise. I was away with my local government head on there rather than my parliamentary one, so I do apologise. Clearly, housing does matter. We should never forget that a house is a home. It is a place where people live, individuals, and bring up families. And therefore, we quite clearly want to see improvements. We want to see increased quality. We want to see quantity improve. We want to ensure that there is choice, there is social housing, the rented sector, and of course, most importantly of all, owner-occupier. And we also remember there are other markets as well, the student-let market, the holiday-let, which do have a role to play in our housing market. But as has already been said, in many respects the solution is actually very straightforward. We just quite simply need to build more homes. But I appreciate that there are barriers to achieving this. Go on, gentlemen.
Because I'm listening to all the contributions, and I'm probably slightly out of step with quite a few people here. Nobody is talking about the failure of the builders to build. The builders are getting the permissions in their tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, but the builders are land banking the permissions, and the land promoters speculate on that. And if we could tackle that problem, would we not get closer to solving the problem?
I'm not totally convinced that is absolutely correct, but it is an interesting point that the Honourable Gentleman makes. And I appreciate that in housing there are a degree of controversy in particular parts of the country. But we should also be careful of having lazy assumptions. There is not a national housing market. There are many variations up and down. London is different from Manchester, Cornwall can be different from Manchester or Leeds, and indeed there's differences between urban and rural, and in many respects it is regional and sub-regional. And if you take my county of Cumbria, the Lake District is a very, very different market from, say, Barrow or Carlisle itself. Also, what is affordable varies considerably. It depends on values, supply, and of course salaries. So therefore the housing market is a bit more nuanced than we sometimes think, and we do have to respect that and think about that when we come to making policy. It is also, in my view, very important that we do not see housing policy in isolation. Tax can have an influence, whether it's council tax, stamp duty, capital gains tax, inheritance tax. They can have an influence on the housing market. How we put around our infrastructure, our connectivity, where train lines go, roads, access to housing and housing developments, bus routes, they all can have an impact on the housing market. And of course, most importantly of all, businesses and economic and employment activity. Of course there are solutions, and honourable members have already touched upon this. Local plans. I wholeheartedly agree the responsibility for a local plan lies with a local authority. And if they don't produce one, then one should be imposed upon them by government. I think that's absolutely right. Tax incentives. We do again need to look at our tax regime, particularly stamp duty and council tax. And then, of course, honourable members have touched upon the planning rules, the requirements. They too need reform. However, in my view, we need to be bigger in our thinking. We need to have strategic thinking. Government needs to be bold, imaginative, visionary, but above all brave. We have an unbalanced nation, principally a north-south divide in our economic performance. The North quite clearly needs a great deal more investment, both public and private. We have economically underperformed in the North for many, many years. But there are opportunities emerging. We have the Green Revolution. We've got the energy policy, the prospects of nuclear plants. There's an industrial renaissance, I hope, starting to happen. The northern economy is still 15% manufacturing. So there are opportunities there. We need more business investment and we need to grow that economy. And I think the government should make a commitment to building 500,000 new homes in the north of England and shift activity to those areas. And to achieve this, you need better connectivity and greater incentive for business. And I agree with my honourable friend about new towns. I think that's an eminently sensible solution. Garden villages can also be part of the solution, as can be reclaiming brownfield sites. And I'd give two little examples of what can be achieved. I look at my own constituency of Carlisle. We have a garden village committed of 10,000 homes. It's been opened up by housing infrastructure funding, which will improve the road infrastructure, which will release those 10,000 homes over the next 10 to 20 years. It is actually well supported. And people do actually want to see places like Carlisle grow, because we actually need critical mass to support the services that we have in our area. We are in many respects an area that does need to attract a greater population. And I was involved with the Borderlands Growth Deal initiative. And if we had a plan of the Borderlands area, there's 1.5 million people in that area, 1.5 million. We superimposed that over London. It stretched from Brighton almost up to Cambridge, almost to Bristol, of which there are over 20 million people. There is room for opportunities for housing. There is opportunities for people to move to places that we at present do not have a supply of housing for. But the critical matter is we need economic activity, we need investment, we need private investment, we need public infrastructure investment. And that, I think, is why we mustn't lose sight of the fact that housing policy cannot be seen in isolation. But if we were to pursue this, I think it's a win-win for all concerned. It takes pressure off parts of the south, it creates a stronger north, fundamental to improving the overall performance of our country. We create a more balanced country, and above all else, will create homes for all.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden for securing today's debate. He will be familiar with New Earswick outside of York, the first garden village, so desirable today for people to live in that place. And as York is nearing the end of its 77-year journey to secure a local plan, I hope the inspectors look at what Labour's proposals were to create new garden towns on the edge of York, very much in keeping with the history of our city, where you have that 15-minute connectivity, the infrastructure you need, the schools, the healthcare facilities and the transport facilities to make a community work. York has a significant housing supply challenge, along with a low-wage economy and exceptionally high housing prices. A single person can afford just 5.6% of properties, but finding those properties is a real challenge. Last year, properties rose in York by 23.1%, the highest anywhere in the country, and of course that cost is costing our economy and costing families, and the challenges are not abating. The only difference is that last month York voted for a Labour council, and as we are committed to doing everything possible to build the homes that people can afford to live in, but we need to look at how we can develop that supply, especially when it comes to starter homes and social homes. I want to encourage the government, first of all, when analysing its consultation on short-term holiday lets, to ensure that robust measures are applied to return lets to residential use. Today, 2,079 lets are currently advertised across the York area, and we need those homes back in circulation. Starting with land, Labour has set out its stall on compulsory purchase. Land needs releasing at scale and at pace, not just for local authorities, but housing associations too. Too much is banked, and while this may be profitable for developers, it is preventing much-needed house building. We need measures where land is re-evaluated and brought into use, and if necessary, through CPOs. There are too many which are gaining the system. So while brownfield first is our policy and our priority, where appropriate, we must see green lungs being placed in the centre of our communities and green spaces, because that's so important for people's well-being and mental health. And we've just seen through the pandemic how people were locked in those high-density communities and the cost that paid to them. Secondly, we have to address funding. In 2012, government imposed an HRA debt on local authorities. Now, despite the HRA debt cap being removed, councils still have to put money aside to pay the debt and interest. The amount available for repairs and retrofit of existing stock is therefore squeezed, blocking the development of social housing as that money has to pay off the loan. It's freezing development, as it is in York. In York, we had around 7,500 properties. The council had to pay for that housing stock using the PWLB loan 121.5 million. This demands 4.5 million of interest payments each year too. We need government to address this as it is restraining development, and I would urge that this is lifted from local authorities' balance sheet as it is choking off opportunities for development, and local authorities do not have the resources to be able to meet the demands. And while government will respond that it has lifted the cap on the HRA, borrowing would be at an even higher interest rate. So we need to see that debt moved on to a different balance sheet. And I want the government minister to respond to that because it is having a chilling effect. Further, local authorities need greater flexibility, also with the right to buy funding, with the receipts currently capped at 40% to reinvest. We need more flexibility in that area too. If I look at the income that York is able to bring in, however, off its stock, it's only 30 million. And of course, once you've addressed of old stock, the retrofit and the repairs, and putting the sustainable measures in, there is very little to spend on development other than getting greater debt and then greater interest. So we end up with low build and a housing crisis, which is what many of our authorities are facing today. Government needs to build out at pace and scale. So we need to address the refinancing. If it is making housing, in a moment, if we think about housing as an investment, and then looking at a 60-year investment because we're going to build the quality of homes that are needed, then we start seeing the equations change. And of course, that investment will not only bring forward the housing, but will bring the opportunity too. I'm happy to give way.
I thank her very much for giving way. You say that government needs to build out. Government doesn't have these planning permissions. It's the planning industry. It's the developers that have these permissions. How are you going to persuade the developers to build out? Because isn't that the issue?
Well, I thank you for the intervention, but that's what I've been talking about, is the structure and the infrastructure that's based around the building environment, which obviously government does control. Third, the government needs to build sustainably, and this can be achieved if Homes England are properly funded. And I'm grateful to Homes England for their time in enabling me to see what they can achieve. But this must not be underfunded so that they have the amount of resources to build the volume that is required and to provide that injection of funding which local authorities also need. We need both, as the local authority requires adequate grant funding to build volume at the necessary standard, rather than having to waste precious land, as we see in so many developments, on those luxury developments often set aside for the Far East market, as opposed to being brought into the local use. And of course, we need to make sure that we build according to needs so that we're not wasting resources and seeing the luxury developments being built which nobody can live in, and that is a real frustration to my community. Fourth, we need to make the numbers count, and rather than having a target, we need to have obligations, and I think the government made a significant mistake in just bringing that down to being a target, because that will mean that there will be a drawing back on the numbers that we need to see and the scale that we need to talk about. And if I may just quickly touch on planning as well, we need to ensure that the larger developers are not just sitting on sites where developers are then stalling the development in areas and gaining on the land. We need to ensure that we get those sites into use as quickly as possible, and I think that has been a significant failing, because as prices rise, then obviously the market itself rises too, and that's certainly something we're seeing in York. And finally, if I may say, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to see investment in planning departments. We've taken over the council recently, completely hollowed out. We don't have a chief planner and it's significantly understaffed. So even if all of that infrastructure is put in place, if we do not have the planning staff on hand, it will stall the opportunity for development. We need land, resources, workforce and ambition. In 18 months, Labour will build the homes people need, tackling the burning injustice of housing poverty and realign government priorities to create a new generation of sustainable homes. Labour will do this. I trust the government will move soon.
Simon Clark.
Speaker, and it's been a genuine pleasure to be part of this evening's debate, and I congratulate my right honourable friend for Holton Price and Howden in his absence for securing it. I'd also like to pay particular tribute to the honourable gentleman for Stretford and Urmston for what I thought was an exemplary speech in which I really couldn't find anything to disagree, and I say that with deep admiration. We must confront the stark reality that we are facing a severe shortfall in our housing because of the policy choices of successive governments, a dearth of political leadership at both local and national level, and a lack of honesty with the public about the consequences every time a member of this House, or a local councillor, or a local campaign group celebrate blocking new homes. The Centre for Cities estimates that our shortfall is as great as 4.3 million homes, and that crisis is stunting our economic growth, it's leaving young people without the space to start a family, and it's trapping renters in unsafe accommodation. It would take us some 50 years at our aimed-for build rate of 300,000 homes a year to put this right, and we are not getting anywhere near that build rate. And of course, historically, we did so much better. Home ownership was a moral mission for the Macmillan government, and it may not have escaped colleagues on this side of the House his attention that his achievements, of course, underpinned his huge election victory in 1959 in the way that Mrs Thatcher won huge support through her right to buy policy. The contrast with the 1960s could hardly be more stark. In that decade, we built 3.6 million more homes, more than we've built in total since the turn of the century. And we've created a supply and demand feedback loop of the worst possible kind. I'm afraid that I must take issue with the Honourable Lady from North Shropshire when she says that the planning system isn't the problem. I'm afraid it is the problem. It is fundamentally broken, and it is what's driving the fact that someone buying their first home now faces paying 9 times their income for it. In the 1980s, it was just 3 times the average salary. I will give way.
Grateful to him for giving way. I'd just like to clarify, it's not the only problem. We give planning permission for all these houses, but we don't build them, and we need to address the build-out problem as well as the planning issue problem.
I think the issue of land banking is something of a straw man in these debates, because I've never seen compelling evidence that it happens. I think that the reality is that developers need a land supply, a predictable land supply, in order to have a programme of forward build, and that is what largely accounts for that question. I'm also very conscious that it is, I'm afraid to say, and I don't want to make this a starkly political debate, often her party who are the worst offenders when it comes to campaigning cynically against the development that we need. And I'd refer colleagues across the House to the Chesham and Amersham by-election a few years ago to see just how detrimental that policy has been in terms of the wider debate. Indeed, arguably, it was that election result which led to the disastrous removal of targets, which I think is what's driving tonight's debate in the first place. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. He talks about the planning system being the problem and not land banking per se. Does he accept the figures from Lichfield that shows from getting planning permission it takes 8.5 years for a first house to be built on a large housing estate, and on average a large housing estate is built out by developers. A 2,000 home housing estate is built out at a rate of 160 homes a year, according to Lichfield, and it takes the best part of 2 decades to build out a 2,000 home housing estate. Is he really saying that the development industry isn't the problem?
I think it is much more about the developers seeking to make sure that they can sell the homes that they need, that they're building, and it's much more also about them having the supply of land available to them predictably to allow them to build into the future, and they obviously are very constrained at the moment by the scarcity of supply. The consequence of where we find ourselves, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the last time house prices were less expensive relative to earnings was, according to Schroders, 1876, the year Victoria became Empress of India. And that should make us all reflect what kind of society we have become. Now, I believe part of the problem is clearly that we need to control immigration more strictly, and I believe strongly that the numbers announced just before recess were unsustainably high. But this is fundamentally a homegrown problem. Our society does not build the homes that we need to accommodate our existing population, and therefore we need to establish clear targets for housing supply. Doing so is not some kind of Stalinist 5-year plan. It is the best way we have yet identified to prevent councils from backsliding on their responsibilities and caving in to what are often small, if noisy, pressure groups. And it's my view that the regrettable decision taken by the Prime Minister last year to weaken those targets by removing their legal force was a mistake, which has already had far-reaching consequences. Now, I'm quite prepared to have a sensible debate about how we set our housing targets. We could change our approach and take as our starting point the existing occupied housing stock of an area and apply a rate at which it should be increased, in line with the national home building target of 300,000 homes a year. Urban areas would see the highest levels of need, allowing a brownfield-focused policy, and no part of the country would be seen as being asked to contribute more than their fair share. This stock-leg starting point for a standard method would remove reliance on discredited housing projections, and you could nuance it, of course, with carve-outs for ANOBs, SSSIs, high concentrations of homes for holiday lets, or indeed where historic drivers of demand like university expansion have ceased to exist. But one thing I would say is that we cannot insist that the Greenbelt should be out of bounds wholly and completely, which is something that the Prime Minister implied recently. The Greenbelt was a 1940s mechanism to prevent urban expansion, pretty crudely drawn on the map. It is not, and I repeat, not a sophisticated environmental protection measure. It is, however, the beneficiary of really effective branding. We have to raise awareness that about 11% of our brownfield land actually lies within the Greenbelt, and that 35% of the Greenbelt is intensive agricultural land of minimal environmental significance. The public deserve to know this, perhaps by designating areas of the Greenbelt that don't have genuine environmental value as orange or amber belt, capable of being developed in exchange for substitution elsewhere. There are other things I could talk about. We could talk about the onerous nutrient neutrality rules, which are blocking huge swathes of housing from the Solent up to Darlington. I see my honourable friend the Minister nodding from her position at the dispatch box. I urge the government to act on this. I think there could be a grand bargain whereby we carve home building out of the HABS regs in exchange for more robust action on the actual polluters, that is to say, our water companies and bad farming practice. And I will say no more on that. I will add that we also need, of course, as we've heard from my honourable friend from Carlisle, the appropriate infrastructure to make sure that new developments succeed, and that's certainly something I want to see in Colby Newham in my constituency, where new homes are now in contemplation at scale. I agree with my right honourable friend from North West Hampshire on the importance of aesthetics. We need to build beautifully to win the argument with communities about the fact that we can actually build well. And I also agree with my right honourable friend from Holton Price and Howden about new garden towns and cities. Where is the ambition that led to Welwyn Garden City or Milton Keynes today? It is absolutely vital that we try and concentrate developments where they can make the most difference, which will often, of course, be around the capital. My final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I crave your indulgence on this, is that this is a cross-party issue. It is an area where we need to work together, not to take cynical advantage where politicians or councils of the opposite party try and do the right thing, because it is the easiest campaign in the world to fight new house building. It is against the interests of this country. We risk becoming a profoundly unequal society, fractured on the twin fault lines of low home ownership and unaffordable rents for cramped, undesirable properties. That is not progress. That isn't something of which any of us can be proud. I do sense the mood in the House is changing on this question. I profoundly hope the government policy will follow suit.
Vicky Ford. Madam Deputy Speaker, Chelmsford, my constituency, has a very vibrant community, excellent schools, low crime rates, a popular city centre, and it's an easy commute to London. It's also the home of the legendary Essex cricket, so it's no wonder that it is a very popular place to live. And since becoming a city in 2012, Chelmsford has grown considerably. In the past 5 years, around 1,000 new homes have been built in each of every year. And in Chelmsford, a new garden community is being built right now. Many honourable members and right honourable members have mentioned new garden cities, communities wanting to see more. Please pop on the train down to Chelmsford and I'll take you to see what we are doing. And many of these new homes that have been built have met the government's definition of affordable housing, because when a new development of over 11 homes is built in Chelmsford, the local authority applies an affordable housing obligation of 35%. Furthermore, over the past decade, many Chelmsford local people have used government schemes to help them get a foot on the housing ladder. But despite the many new homes, despite the fact that many of them meet the government's definition to be affordable, despite the many years of generous support for people to help buy their homes, we still have a real shortage of housing that people can either afford to buy or afford to rent. And the pressure on social housing is acute. Around 360 families are currently housed in temporary accommodation. That is an all-time high. I've spoken about this before in this place when I presented my bill on conversions of office blocks into homes. In Chelmsford, many office blocks are being converted into homes. In the past 9 years that we have data for, approval was given for over 1,400 homes to have been created from converting office blocks into flats. And we're expecting to see even more of that because, of course, post-pandemic, more people are working from home, there is less demand for office space, so we expect to see more conversions. But there is currently no ability for the local authority to apply an affordable housing obligation when a commercial property is converted into flats. So you can literally take an entire office block and convert it entirely into luxury flats without causing one single extra affordable home to be created. Now, my 10-minute rule bill would enable local authorities to apply an affordable housing obligation to conversions of commercial property to residential use. And if we'd been able to have that in the past decade in Chelmsford, it could have released 453 more new affordable homes, i.e. more than a number of families who are currently in temporary accommodation because they can't get social housing. So I do hope that my wonderful honourable friend, the Housing Minister, is listening this evening and she will continue to look favourably at my suggestion. Another issue that's often raised by my constituents is infrastructure. Now, many people in Chelmsford tell me that they're not opposed to new homes being built. They know that people need somewhere to live. But they're getting more and more frustrated of seeing new homes going up and the infrastructure not keeping pace. And it has not kept pace in Chelmsford with the massive growth in housing. Now, in Chelmsford, the City Council uses the Community Infrastructure Levy, the SIL. This is much better than the old Section 106 approach. It gives more flexibility to how developer contributions are used for infrastructure, and that means that both existing residents and residents of a new development can benefit from that new infrastructure. But there are some problems with SIL funding. For example, there's no SIL contribution for new houses on, quote, previously developed land. Now, as a lover of the Green Belt, of course I want to prioritise building on brownfield sites. And I recognise that some brownfield sites are costly to develop due to previous contamination. And if a levy cost was put on top of the decontamination cost, then that might make those sites unprofitable for developers and they wouldn't get developed. But not all previously developed land is contaminated and brings that contamination cost. But every single home that is being built puts additional pressure on the infrastructure. Let me give you the example. If you build on a field that used to be a farm, then, provided it's more than 11 homes, you pay the contribution towards infrastructure. But if you build on what used to be a riding school, you don't. And I hope that the Minister, and through the work in the department, will look at closing this anomaly and closing it in a way
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yeah.
I'd like us to give way. It's a point she raised. In many ways, what she's saying is going to cut across what I'm going to say. And I think what this is because is that property values, say in Chelmsford, are much, much higher than they say are in Lowestoft. And therefore, you know, we're illustrating what my honourable friend, the member from Carlisle, said, that we actually have lots of different property markets throughout the country. And would you not agree with me that what's right for one place may not necessarily be right for another?
I absolutely agree that what is right for one place may not be right for another. I would just like to point out that all of my suggestions are set to enable local authorities to make the right decisions for their areas. So this would not be top-down quotas set by government on what proportion of affordable homes you would put on which office block development. That would be the decision of the local authority in line with their local plan. But what, at the moment, the local authority does not have that power at all. A second point about the SIL funding is that at the moment SIL funding is not sufficient to cover all infrastructure needs, especially when you have larger infrastructure projects due to larger developments. I'm extremely grateful to the government for the £250,000 Housing Infrastructure Fund grant for Chelmsford. As a result of this grant, a new train station is being built. This is the first time a new train station has been built on the Great Eastern Main Line for over a century. It's the most amazing engineering project. And the grant will also help to deliver our North East bypass. Both of these are crucial to delivering the Garden community. But these two projects alone will not deal with the other massive problems we have from traffic jams due to the increased number of people living locally. And people from all over Essex are wasting valuable time stuck in Chelmsford's traffic jams, and that's hampering economic growth in large parts of Essex. So could I urge the DLUHC ministers to urgently help me to get support for the bid, which is currently with the Treasury team, for funding to upgrade the Army and Navy junction with a package of new sustainable traffic measures. Without this investment, Chelmsford will grind to a halt and will not be able to support the future housing growth. Finally, there are real concerns about how SIL money is allocated locally. The process is not transparent, and decisions about significant amounts of money are made without it coming back to full council members for approval. Cost overruns appear out of control, especially since the Lib Dems took over control of the council. They spent £4 million on refurbishing a theatre, which was meant to cost £1 million. Redesigning Tyndall Square with fancy pavements at the top of the High Street has cost over £4 million, more than double that of the original budget. Furthermore, the SIL monies are not necessarily being spent by the Lib Dems on people's priorities. My constituents often tell me about the pressure on NHS GP surgeries. They spent tens of millions of pounds in the past 4 years, but the two projects to really help enlarge the GP surgeries capacity have been massively delayed. We need to get better planning ahead by local authorities and all different areas that need infrastructure, including the NHS, to make sure that all sectors of critical infrastructure keep pace with housing growth, because if we don't do that, we will lose public support for the new homes.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a genuine pleasure to be involved in this debate. I congratulate the member for Houghton, Price and Howden, who's not currently in his chair, for bringing this debate to Parliament. It is, as my honourable friend from Middlesbrough said, it is something that needs to be a cross-party consensus. And I think broadly we've achieved some degree of consensus over the course of this debate. And that's important because successive governments over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades, maybe even more, of every colour political persuasion, have tried to resolve the housing issue. And unfortunately, the interventions that they've made have been probably no more than tweaks, and these tweaks have had the effect of actually further distorting the complex feedback system that is what we call the housing market. it's not really a market in the traditional sense, and it certainly, as my honourable friend from Carlisle noted, it could at best be described as a series of local markets distributed pretty randomly around the country. Most of these interventions that governments have made over the course of the last half a century or so have been demand side, and we've had far too many demand side interventions, and that has just driven up prices and driven away affordability.
Supply side.
Simply, we're not building enough houses in the right places, and the shortage of housing supply has a direct impact on housing prices. Cost of home ownership and renting has been rising steadily, outpacing wages and inflation. And in the UK, now the gap between house prices in high demand areas like London and the rest of the country has doubled over recent years. So our market is broken. Land prices follow economic activity, and obviously economic activity or land prices drive up house prices. What was once the symptom... Yes, of course.
I'm most grateful. I apologise for giving away yet again. I just want to make the point, or I want to ask him the question. When developers restrict build out in order to keep land prices high, isn't the answer to have a use it or lose it rule, or to have pressure on developers or find a way, market mechanisms to make them build more quickly, because there are 1 million outstanding permissions, 500,000 on brownfield sites?
I'm grateful for his intervention. I think he might be zeroing in on a particular aspect of the picture that I've painted of the broken market, and I think the behaviour or the perceived behaviour in some cases of developers and builders is not necessarily the cause. It is more a symptom of some of the issues that I've been discussing.
Will you weigh on that?
Yes.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. He's making a very good speech. But on our friend from the Isle of Wight, my county colleague, on his numbers, at a rate of building of what we're doing at the moment, about 200,000, that is between 4 and 5 years' supply of building in an uncertain planning environment, which I illustrated earlier is a huge gamble. But would you agree with me that actually it's more likely that land prices are driven by the existence of the viability test, which means you can't overpay for land, rather than land prices being driven by the value of the property, i.e. downwards, which means that land is at an unrealistic value as it stands?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think that one of the, in fact, in any regulated environment, what the market players require, what they're incredibly hungry for, is clarity, consistency, and certainty. Exactly. And we have a system that is so complex and subject to so many historic changes and, to be frank, future changes, that none of the clarity, consistency, and certainty that the market players, the people that will provide these houses, can see. They just don't have the confidence to be able to put bricks and mortar into the ground. We're calling for massive reform, but we do, in some sense, need to put that certainty to good use. But massive reform first, and then some certainty. So I'm grateful for the interventions. The market, though, is currently broken. Land prices are following the economic activity, and this is the critical point, Madam Deputy Speaker. What was once the symptom of the need to level up is now a cause too, because when we do go through all the pain of building those houses, getting those houses through planning and get them built, very often we end up with identical estates, massive 4-bedroomed houses that look exactly like the suite of estates that we have in our existing stock. It does nothing for mobility between our existing sector, which of course is about 99% of the stock that we have, and the new build sector. It does not give people who are under-occupying former family homes in the existing sector a viable option to move out. They're not genuinely affordable and attainable for young local first-time buyers, and they're not appropriate for elderly people looking to downsize and retire and live in retirement living. So there are multiple issues, but fundamentally we're building the wrong kind of houses in the wrong places. My honourable friend from Northampton South touched on SME builders, labour shortages, material shortages, build cost inflation, access to finance, so I won't go on those. But one of the key barriers in that mobility between the existing stock and the current and the potential new build stock is stamp duty. Stamp duty is a tax on social mobility. It is crippling the mobility within the sectors that we need to drive economic activity, and we need to set the people free in terms of their labour mobility as well. I'm going to skip bits on the planning system and resourcing the planning department for reasons of time, but I want to end with a reason to be optimistic, to be hopeful, because we have a huge opportunity. We are pouring billions of pounds into left behind communities through the Levelling Up Fund, the High Street Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Towns Fund. All of this is based around the concept of levelling up being around opportunities for people that need somewhere to live. So we need to revisit the algorithm, recast the targets. We need to put much more emphasis on where we are creating, stimulating demand through the billions of pounds that we're investing as a government through levelling up, and to make it sustainable for the future so that communities can benefit from the economic growth from the levelling up agenda, but then be sustainable because they have people that are living and building families and communities in the places where they work.
Craig McKinley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Very little has been said about the reason that we have such demand for housing and the problems with planning at the moment. Those figures, I think, that my right honourable friend from Halton, I'll never forget your full name, Halton, Price and Howden, mentioned was that there are 10 million greater population since 1997. And this last year alone, 606,000 net migration. Multiply that up for the next 26 years, without population growth of excess births over deaths, that's at least a 15 million more population over the next 26 years. So if we have a 4.1 million deficit in houses required today, that is going to get only even worse into the future. One wonders where the new people coming into the country now, the 606,000 just last year, big number the year before that, are actually living. Students, of course, are one issue. They may be in halls of residence, but many people will be joining family in the UK, friends perhaps, and they will not have yet found their feet. And then you've also got to think of where do the existing population trying to leave home for the first time, where are they actually living? We did manage to accommodate some 170,000 from Ukraine over the last year, but that was almost sort of the sofa surfing example. If people do stay, they will want to find their feet in their own accommodation, which will not be shared HMO type, very high density. So we're building up an even bigger problem for the future. Nobody's even discussed, will we ever have enough builders? Will we have enough building materials, etc., to actually build out those numbers? So my argument is one of supply of people and how we actually go about solving this. I've broken this down into, and I really want to make progress. We've got very little time this evening. So I would say we need to reduce immigration. I would say we need to take measures to reduce internal relocation, which does happen within the country, and that is very much on the levelling up agenda. There'd be nobody more pleased than I, living in the southeast, for the relocation of populations to go, up towards Carlisle and elsewhere. I'd be absolutely delighted with that. Do we need to encourage families? Because we live differently these days, whereas in times of old, and perhaps I do look to the past, families did sort of stay together. You had people live together in multi-generational units, and not least looking after each other as they got older, and that's quite a norm in European countries. Or, another one, we may have to build prolifically, and that is what we've been discussing this evening. Where do we build? Where do we build? We're all NIMBYs, one way or another, and it's not surprising that most people in the country are. The property that they own is likely to be either the biggest asset they've got in life, or more than likely, the biggest liability in terms of what they owe on it. So they do not want what they have purchased and created in their own communities to be, at all tainted. And I don't blame people for thinking that way. Now, if I reflect on some sites across my constituency, there's a number, and we'll all have them. When there is a proposed development, there is always a great deal of opposition, a great deal of it. In Preston, a village in my constituency, there was an old transport site, huge opposition while it was being built out. In Ash, another village, huge opposition when a development called Harfleet Gardens was being built out. But sometimes these smaller villages almost need that extra development to make them credible-sized villages where you can support the shop, the pub, the chemists and everything else. So I think there is a sweet spot, and I think most people do recognise that. Obviously in favour of brownfield development where and whenever it can happen. But a lot of these new builds are exactly as described by many members here this evening, not least my friend from Northwest Hampshire, in terms of they all end up looking exactly the same. So instead of solving a problem, they're often creating a problem. But what I would really want to concentrate tonight is, why don't we try and use the existing housing stock that we have to best use, using the tax system? Why don't we consider a downsizing relief for stamp duty so that we can liberate some bigger houses that perhaps widows and widowers are now living in, not perfect for them by any standard, expensive to heat, high council tax and all the rest of it. But when they look at the cost of downsizing in terms of a stamp duty cost, particularly in high cost areas, older people know the value of money and they'll say, well, I'm simply not paying that. And I'll stay where I am, in the wrong accommodation, in the wrong place as their needs change. But most importantly, it's an issue of capital gains tax. We are stopping people getting rid of second homes. Now, there's been a number of studies of how many second homes there might be in the country. Rather than penalise people with increasing council tax and saying, we know best, we're not going to allow you to have a second home, how dare you, I would rather us create a tax system where people are encouraged to get rid of the second home. I'm in practice as a chartered accountant, and there's been a number of cases where I've had a client through the door, newly widowed, and so I'd like to get rid of that second home that might exist in Devon or in Kent or anywhere else, often smaller properties in the right places where communities are complaining that their communities have been hollowed out because there isn't a settled community. So they come to an accountant like me and say, we've had this home since 1980, it cost us £20,000, I'd like to get rid of it. I have to tell them, you can't get rid of that, you'll face a 28% capital gains tax charge, and then if that cash is in your account, and the natural will happen in due course and you pass away, you will then face an inheritance tax charge on the cash that is in your account. Or if you're not in a taxable estate, that uplift in value, if you keep that property, will simply be uplifted for your family, completely free of tax. So we are binding up hundreds of thousands of second properties in the right places because of the tax trap. Now that to me could be hundreds of thousands, perhaps a whole year's worth of the development that we're looking for in the right places, simply because we're not brave enough, because we're frightened of what perhaps the opposition might say. We've talked a lot about party unity or cross-house unity. Surely at times like this, we should say, yes, let's use the tax system to liberate homes, save some green belts or some green areas which will always cause problems, not least from the Lib Dems at election time, and say, let's work together and maximise the properties that we have. That, to me, would be a sincere step in the right direction. So a slightly different attack I'm taking this evening. Not only have we got to look at the numbers of people, and that is very much an immigration case, but let's use the properties that we have by using the tax system. Doesn't need one new build, one new builder, or one new development. Let's do that first.
Peter Alders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this important debate, and I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Halton Price and Howden, for securing and leading it. Before I came to this place, I practiced as a chartered surveyor for 27 years in Suffolk and Norfolk, and much of my work focused on the residential development sector, advising landowners, house builders, and also local authorities. Today, my involvement revolves around meeting the needs of often desperate constituents seeking a decent home, addressing concerns with regard to the pressure on infrastructure that arises from developments, and working with local authorities to regenerate town centres. The extent of the national housing crisis has been graphically illustrated by what we've heard from around this chamber this evening, and also it's been emphasised by Crisis, the National Housing Federation and Policy Exchange in the briefings that they have provided us. All of them go on to illustrate the advantages of a vibrant and dynamic house-building sector. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the time available to me, I shall briefly highlight how I believe we can meet this major challenge. Firstly, it is important to focus on all sectors of the housing market, and this includes the elderly, and the need to ensure that we have sufficient and properly laid out and designed homes for older people. I mention this as I co-chair the Housing and Care for Older People, APPG, along with the Noble Lord Best, who does much vital work in this sector. We have an ageing population who need and deserve properly adapted and comfortable homes. The provision of more such accommodation will free up other homes for others to move into. Secondly, we must also build more homes for social rent. Both Crisis and the National Housing Federation calculate that we need to build 90,000 homes for social rent each year if we are to tackle the current homelessness crisis. Policy Exchange also highlight that if we invest in and expand social house building, we also restart the stalled conveyor belt of home ownership. Thirdly, there is a need to improve the planning system, to ensure that all local planning authorities are functioning properly, that they all have up-to-date local plans supplemented by local design codes, and that they all determine planning applications promptly. Planning departments must be properly resourced and adequately staffed in order to do this, and this means they need the funding from national government. Fourthly, one of the solutions to the housing supply crisis is already in place in the form of Homes England, who do good work in facilitating development on challenging sites, invariably in urban areas, and will also provide development finance through the Levelling Up Home Builders Fund. It would help if their role and their resources could be increased so that they can do more in facilitating urban regeneration. My fifth point is that we should also give consideration as to whether there is a need for investment zones to promote the redevelopment of derelict sites in urban areas. In Lowestoft, in my constituency, the enterprise zone, which is focused on commercial development, has been a great success, though to a degree it has run out of steam and is in need of re-energising. The proposed investment zones that were announced last September did provide a vehicle for doing this. The proposals that Suffolk County Council and East Suffolk Council worked up included large, primarily residential redevelopment sites, the Sanyo, the Geldwen and the Brook sites, and thus it is disappointing that the plans for investment zones that were announced in the March budget were much more limited than was originally proposed. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm mindful of another challenge that confronts us in towns and cities across the country: the decline of our high streets and town centres, which urgently need revitalising. In these locations, there are millions of square feet of former office and shop space, often on upper floors, and we need to promote and encourage their residential reuse. If we do this, we can provide customers for the shops and for the leisure facilities that remain in those town centres. Invariably, these properties can be difficult to convert, and thus too readily at times developers prefer greenfield sites. We need to work with those developers to remove the barriers to carrying out town centre projects. As a start, the government could consider the zero rating of VAT for conversion and refurbishment work so as to put such projects on a level playing field with new build. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, increasing the supply of new housing opportunities is a panacea for many of the challenges that we face. Providing people with warm and decent homes, enabling them to get that first important step on the housing ladder, improving the nation's health, regenerating urban areas and town centres, and delivering meaningful levelling up. Thank you.
Bob Seeley.
Very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm going to slightly break the consensus, but not, I hope, in an unhelpful way. It's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend from Waveney. I thought you made some excellent points, especially about shops, and it was one of the things that the NIMBY rebels like myself brought up with various right honourable friends, the need to actually use the property, the stock that we have. I want to thank my right honourable friend from Holton Howden for securing this debate, and actually I agree with a lot of what he said, but it's not an either or, it's an and. Yes to new towns, yes to new villages, yes to new these green garden villages, towns and cities, but we also need to get the system working. My significant, where I take a lot of issue with people is people think this is a system failure. To me, above all else, I think it's a market failure, and I do agree with what the Honourable Lady from North Shropshire said about the need for rural affordable housing. That is a massive problem in my patch. On the Isle of Wight, we've increased our population by 50-60%. We've doubled our population in the last 50-60 years. We've never really built for locals. We need to be prioritising local building. I would overwhelmingly prioritise affordable housing. Yes, I would have lower targets because we've got an amazing landscape. 75% of the island is protected. We need to protect that, but we need to look after our own people, especially on an island. I'm going to throw out some facts because I know we have a problem with house building in this country, but I do think it's important to note. And my honourable friend from South Middlesbrough and East Cleveland, we've built 2.5 million homes since 2010. Last year, according to the House of Commons Library, 400,000 first-time buyers, the best for 30 years. 829,000 people in this Conservative government have been helped. And we are building, on average, since 2015, 222,000 homes a year. Those are actually quite respectable, especially, dare I say it, compared to New Labour, when they were building, according to the House of Commons Library, 171,000 homes a year. So we have a problem, but to say we are not building when we have built 2,500 homes since 2010, and when since 2015 we're building 222,000 homes a year, I think we have to slightly nuance the points that we're making. We know that other factors are playing the role. Immigration. Huge rates of immigration. If you've got 600,000 net, unless you're building close to 1 million homes a year, you're in trouble. We know that the printing of money, quantitative easing, as a sensible man like my right friend will know, is very bad news because you've got inflation in house prices and assets. Interest rates have been too low for too long. And we've got a problem, as my honourable friend from North Devon will know, with second homes, etc. In the few minutes that I have, I'm just going to rattle through a few points, if I may. OK, what do I mean about the market failure? After the crash, 70% of supply is delivered by the 10 largest developers, and they are responsible for a vast number of the planning permissions that we have. According to Litchfield Surveyors, and they're a very respectable outfit, they do a lot of the thinking on this sort of thing, it takes 20 years to build out a housing estate of 2,000 homes. From initial permission, it takes 8.5 years until you have your first home. I'm sure you could speed that up, but that's how long it's taking, and a lot of that is developer slowness. And they then build out at a rate of 150, 160 homes a year. And so somebody getting a 2,000 home planning permission now is going to finish that development in 2043. So the question that I have, is there something that we can be doing to speed up the process? If you're a developer with a good reputation, if you're a builder with a good reputation, you've got a small site, it's brownfield, you're going to throw in some social housing, or you're working with affordable housing, shouldn't you go to the front of the queue? If you say you're going to build out very quickly, you bounce the big developers into better behaviour. So I'm wondering if there's much more that we could be doing. I just want to say a few things about the so-called NIMBY rebellion, which I don't think was very NIMBY, and I'm not even sure was a rebellion. We had a few issues. A significant issue with the stuff that pains me. The lazy developer reliance on greenfield, low-density, out-of-town housing estates, because they are unsustainable. And it's great for the, and the Honourable Member from Stretford and Ormston made a very impassioned, a very eloquent speech. But if you're saying greenfield, develop, I mean, where does that fit in with our climate change agenda? We know that high-density cities are a critical way of reaching net zero. We have some of the lowest density cities in the world. Sheffield has a density 1/10 of Barcelona. That is an extraordinary statistic. Sheffield, 1,500 people per square kilometre. Barcelona, 16,000. They're both slight outliers, but if you look at London, about 9,000 per square kilometre. Paris, 12,000. You look at Newcastle, Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham, about 3,000 people per square kilometre. Valencia, Basel, Bilbao, Geneva, almost double that. So we have a problem with density in our country. When it comes to top-down housing targets, the problem with top-down housing targets is the developers game the system. They get the permissions, as the Honourable Lady from North Shropshire says. They sit on them for 8-9 years. And then they come back to us, to the councils, like the Isle of Wight Council, and say, you haven't built. You haven't built. So we're going to push through more. So that system isn't working. But what else did the so-called NIMBYs want? We want greater powers for compulsory purchase. We want government to say to lazy developers who sit on places for years, you've got 6 months to build out, or we put that place on the market for you. We have strongly recommended a character test for builders as well, so that if you're a bad builder and you don't treat people with respect, or you don't build, you don't get the permission. We want more focus on smaller sites. We need more focus still on the 500,000 brownfield site properties. We know that London is particularly bad. It's building a quarter of the homes that we need, and that's really stifling the targets and the numbers. I love the idea of the properties above shops. We said that to our right honourable friend from Surrey Heath when we were negotiating for this. We want more emphasis on that. We wanted more emphasis as well on affordable housing, so that councils like Shropshire or mine on the Isle of Wight could really force this stuff through. So when it comes to being a NIMBY, actually what we're doing very often is finding a better way to fix the system, whether it's having last-time sellers. So if you're old and you want to downsize, you pay a significantly reduced rate of stamp duty to encourage people to free up the market. 50-year or 30-year fixed-rate loans, so you know what you're getting. Because actually last year, before interest rates rises started going up, I know house prices were rising, but because interest rates are very low, actually housing was relatively affordable historically, statistically. It's less affordable now because our interest rates have gone up 5% to historic average rather than being historic low. So I will now wind up to say that I hope the government sticks to the agreements. There's a lot that we could be doing to free up the market and to actually make the market work rather than just attack the system. Thank you.
Lady Saxby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my right honourable friend from Houghton, Price and Howden for this important debate. North Devon presents challenges consistent with many coastal and tourist destinations in delivering new housing alongside retaining our existing housing for local residents. The planning system is not designed for rurality. North Devon is so remote with a lack of planners, builders and materials, we build at just 18% affordable units due to viability concerns. The local plan has mostly delivered the targeted number of houses, yet still we have nothing like the number of affordable homes we need. Everything takes an eternity, and far too often the affordable element is cut out of developments. Brownfield sites, particularly derelict buildings, lie empty for years, if not decades, while stuck in planning disputes, often to retain late-listed facades that are not valuable enough to warrant historic investment schemes, yet render them unviable. Fortunately, the 5-year land supply is now back intact, but that has taken 3 years, and numerous developments wave through on beautiful greenfields due to this situation. Overlay this with the rapid switching by landlords post the Osborne tax reforms that came in during the pandemic from long-term rentals to short-term holiday lets. We have lost 67% of our long-term rentals post-pandemic, meaning moving to North Devon for work or being able to afford to buy at all, as one of the fastest rising house price regions in the country, is just not viable, leaving us with a housing crisis, a word I don't use lightly. Hopefully with some light on the horizon, with accommodation being the next phase of development on our hospital site, as health and social care are the sectors worst impacted by the current housing crisis, rapidly followed by the other emergency services in our schools. Solutions are hard to come by, but to really tackle the situation in North Devon, which indeed has some unique challenges, being highly designated and prized for its remote beauty, building on endless green fields is not popular, or in my mind, in the least bit desirable. We need a more strategic and better resourced planning system for all of Devon. Our small district councils almost have a rotating door policy of planners moving from one council to another for a better position, or are a final stop before retirement. And I don't blame them, there's nowhere nicer to retire to. But we need an extended and enhanced planning team that proactively wants to deal with the derelict buildings scattered across my constituency. Empty hotels in Ilfracombe, a care home in Instow, the former lace factory in the Oliver buildings in Barnstaple, alongside the redevelopment of the old leisure centre. Numerous empty properties scattered around. Yet in the past week alone, my inbox has seen planning applications above shops in Barnstaple town centre turned down as it may flood in 84 years' time. Locally, the council could reverse the planning restrictions they have placed on properties that, when built, were only allowed to be holiday homes, where owners would now prefer to move to permanent residential, surely to be encouraged. But no, an endless series of hurdles, from owners being told they have to sell them or install all sorts of extra measures just so a barn can be converted for a child to live in now that child is an adult. But they can convert to a holiday let with no problems at all. It is no wonder developers struggle to build in North Devon. Even when they do, it's easier to build for holiday lets than for permanent residences, as borne out across endless farms. In my mind, for small villages, community land trusts need to be simplified and learnings from rural communities more widely shared. Again, delays in planning make even pre-application work months and months before any response is forthcoming. And when we do build, we need to ensure that these properties are available to local families who want to live and work in North Devon. Far, far too many properties are just sold as holiday lets. We have to take some responsibility as a community if we want to remain a community and not become some sort of cross between a holiday park and a nursing home with no staff to service either. An additional town. I mean, I don't mind an additional town, but when I say town, I'm not thinking Milton Keynes. I'm more the size of my third biggest town, 4,000 to 5,000 residents, within commuting distance of Exeter, adjacent to the Link Road, may be an option. But unless we can sort our strategic planning so there is public transport and proper facilities such as health, education and even water, as we're on a hosepipe ban already, and a road network that is fit for purpose, we really are struggling to deliver the houses our community so desperately needs. First and foremost for me would be to use the properties we have more effectively. I have campaigned relentlessly since being elected to this place to tackle the exponential increase in holiday lets in North Devon. Yes, we love our tourists and warmly welcome folk from all over the world, but our housing market is out of kilter. There are now not enough homes to enable people to live and work in our vital tourism economy. We need to expedite plans for registers of holiday lets, to introduce planning changes for people to move from long-term to short-term rentals, reverse the Osborne tax changes, or at the very least ensure an even tax playing field between long-term and short-term rentals, and ensure there is not a discrepancy between schemes such as EPC, designed to protect tenants, but in old rural properties is increasing the flood to a proper tidal wave of landlords exiting the long-term rental market. If the housing stock we had were utilised more of the time, we might not need to build so much. On the close of less than 30 houses I rent on, one has been derelict for over 15 years, almost a half a second homes, often left empty for 3/4 of the year or more. These are 2-3 beds up, 2 down homes. The latest to be valued at £575,000 is out of the reach of most locals. Is there no way some of these properties empty for so much of the year can be made available to our invaluable public sector workers? We cannot allow our coastal communities to become ghost towns for much of the year, and I hope more will be done to utilise the buildings already standing more effectively and improve our strategic planning to tackle and rebalance our housing market.
Yeah. Shadow Minister Matthew Penny.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to respond for the opposition in this important and timely debate. I congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Halton Price and Howden, for securing it, and the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. I also thank all of those honourable members who have participated this evening. In addition to the thoughtful and compelling remarks, opening remarks of the Right Honourable Gentleman, there have been a large number of what I think have been extremely well argued, informed and insightful contributions. Madam Deputy Speaker, while there is good reason to treat sceptically the argument that boosting housing supply in and of itself will quickly and significantly improve house price affordability or address what are essentially now static levels of home ownership, there is no question that a significant uplift in rates of house building is an integral part of the solution to England's chronic housing crisis. It is undeniable that as a nation we have clearly not built enough houses over recent decades to meet housing need, particularly in London and what might be termed the Greater South East. So it is imperative that we address this historic undersupply of homes. To the best of my knowledge, Madam Deputy Speaker, no Conservative minister has ever explained precisely why the number was chosen, but the government made a commitment in its manifesto to build 300,000 homes a year by the middle of this decade. Even accounting for the additional supply facilitated by the progressive expansion of permitted development rights since 2013, many of them incredibly poor quality office to residential conversions, the government has never come close to approaching, let alone hitting, that annual target. In 2021-22, net additional dwellings stood at just 232,820. And that level of output, respectable but ultimately insufficient, was of course achieved prior to the range of concessions the government made, in its weakness, to the so-called planning concern group of Conservative backbenchers late last year. In the aftermath of that abdication of responsibility, we have, predictably, seen scores of local plans across the country stalled, delayed or withdrawn. In the face of this alarming trend, ministers contend that we need not worry because the proposed changes to the National Planning Policy Framework will, they argue, ultimately boost local plan coverage and in turn housing supply. Yet even if that is what ultimately transpires, Madam Deputy Speaker, and there is good reason, I would argue, to doubt it, it would be a form of increased local plan coverage that is entirely disconnected from the government's purported aim of building 300,000 new homes per annum, because the intended effect of the proposed changes is to allow local planning authorities to develop and adopt local plans that fail to meet the needs of wider housing market areas in full. As such, we now have a situation where the government's manifesto commitment to 300,000 homes a year remains alive, but in name only, abandoned in practice, but not formally abolished, in order that the Secretary of State and his ministers can still insincerely cite it in a risible effort to convince this House and the British public that they did not agree, consciously and deliberately, to plan for less housing in England over the coming years in order to placate a disgruntled group of backbenchers. And I will happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank him for giving way to a disgruntled backbencher. I think actually if you read the NWBF letter, the Dear Colleague letter, you will find that although there is a leeway in housing targets, there is set to be higher density, there's set to be more liberalisation in many areas, and actually a lot of what we tried to achieve was to free up the market to make it work better.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with the honourable gentleman, because whether it is by means of the emphasis in the proposed NPPF on locally prepared plans providing for, quote, sufficient housing only, the softening of land supply and delivery test provisions, the ability to include historical over-delivery in 5-year housing land supply calculations, or the listing of various local characteristics that would justify a deviation from the standard method. The intended outcome of those changes is to allow local authorities to plan to meet under the targets that nominally remain in place. So, as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, the choice the government made entails a deliberate shift from a plan-led system focused on making at least some attempt at meeting England's housing need to one geared toward providing only what the politics of any given area will allow, with all the implications the resulting suppressed rates of house building will have on those affected by the housing crisis and economic growth more widely. Madam Deputy Speaker, the next Labour government will fix this mess. When it comes to housing and planning, our overriding objective will be to get house building rates up, and up significantly from the nadir we will surely inherit, including, as part of that effort, markedly increasing the supply of affordable homes and particularly genuinely affordable social homes to rent. We do not intend to pluck an annual national target out of the air and ineptly contort the system to try to make the numbers across the country add up, as the government have done, by imposing an entirely arbitrary 35% uplift that most of the 20 cities and urban centres in England to which it applies are clear cannot possibly be accommodated. But we will insist that the planning system is once again, I won't give way, geared toward meeting housing need in full. To that end, if they are enacted as expected, a Labour government will reverse the damaging changes the government proposed to make to the NPPF in relation to planning for housing. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, while reversing those damaging changes to national planning policy will be an essential first step, more far-reaching reform will be required if we are to overcome the limitations of a speculative house building model, a broken land market, and a planning system that is at once both too permissive and too restrictive. That will mean, among many other things, overhauling England's dysfunctional planning structures so that the system more effectively facilitates strategic housing growth across those sub-regional areas with significant unmet need. And that might be by way of extensions to existing urban settlements or entirely new settlements. I would argue I think we need both, and both in good measure. And it will mean more proactive public sector involvement in housing delivery on large sites across the country, so that quality placemaking and long-term value creation become more than just the rare exception. Let me make clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour's approach will not be premised on a drive for units at any cost. We appreciate that many local communities do resist, as has been mentioned in the debate, development because it entails poor quality housing in inappropriate and often entirely car-dependent locations without the necessary physical and social infrastructure for communities to thrive, or sufficient levels of affordable housing to meet local need. That outcome, we would argue, is a direct consequence of the government's over-reliance on private house builders building homes for market sale to meet overall housing need. Yet when it comes to house building, there need not be an inherent trade-off between quantity and quality. A Labour government will be determined to see increased rates of house building, but as equally determined that much more supply come via a long-term stewardship approach, so that if not removed entirely, public opposition to significant development in contested areas should at least be much reduced. Similarly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we reject the notion that building more homes must come at the expense of wider national policy objectives. In addition to increasing housing supply in a way that prioritises quality of build and quality of place, we will act to ensure the housing and planning system play their full part in addressing other pressing national challenges, such as the drive towards net zero, the need for urgent nature restoration, and improving public health. So to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not the only way of solving England's housing problems, and it certainly will not be a panacea for them. But building more homes remains the most effective way we have of tackling almost all of those housing-related problems with which our country is contending. The government needed to build more homes before the so-called Planning Concern Group extracted their damaging concessions late last year. As a result of the government's appeasement of that group, we now face the very real prospect that house building rates will plummet over the next 12 to 18 months. We desperately need a change of approach, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it is a change that the present government and the ministers opposite are incapable of delivering. It's high time we had a general election so that they can make way for a government that is serious about ensuring that we build to meet housing need in full and boost economic growth.
Before I call the Minister, I have to say I'm extremely disappointed that some colleagues were not here to hear the opposition wind-ups. It's as important to be here for the opposition wind-ups as it is to be here for the Minister's wind-ups. It's extremely discourteous not to be here. Minister Rachel Maclean.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a real pleasure to respond on behalf of the Government. I want to start by thanking very much my right honourable friend for Halton Price and Howden for securing this important debate, and it's a tribute to him, I think, that so many people have come to speak, reflect the experiences of their constituents and also the local housing conditions. I want to thank the member for Stratford and Urmston, the first of two former housing ministers that spoke, my right honourable friend for North West Hampshire, member for North Antrim, Northampton South, Weaver Vale, Rugby, North Shropshire, Carlisle, York Central, Milton Keynes North, South Thanet, Waveney, another, of course, housing minister, Middlesbrough, South East and Cleveland, my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Chelmsford, the Isle of Wight and North Devon. And I think all of them, I'm sure everyone will agree, gave thoughtful, constructive, knowledgeable and in some cases rightly challenging contributions. The points that have been raised today by honourable members have underscored the importance of this government's mission to drive up housing supply and to deliver on our manifesto commitment of delivering 1 million additional homes by the end of this Parliament. They've emphasised the urgency of our work to build more homes of all tenures in the places where they are so desperately needed. And firstly, I thought someone was trying to ask me to give way. No, I'm sorry. I thought I heard the same thing. Does my honourable friend want to...
For a point to come in order to show my support for the front bench by reminding her that this Conservative government has averaged 222,000 homes a year, when under New Labour, the party opposite managed about 171,000. So even when we're doing allegedly badly, we're still 50,000 ahead of Labour.
I'm so grateful for my honourable friend for making that point. I was just about to make it. And of course, the government, as he has said himself, remains committed to its ambition of delivering 300,000 homes a year. Homes fit for a new generation, as my right honourable friend has said. I also agree with him as a Conservative. I agree with a property-owning democracy. And despite the economic challenges, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, global inflation, we have made real progress towards that target. In 2021-22, over 232 homes were delivered, the third highest yearly rate for the last 30 years. Since 2010, over 2.3 million additional homes have been delivered. This is the achievement of a Conservative government, which I think is fantastic compared to the woeful record of the last Labour government. At the same time, we are not complacent, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the scale of the challenges that have dogged England's housing market for decades and which many honourable members have referenced today: demand outstripping supply, local shortages, residents being priced out of the places that they grew up. That's why we have committed £10 billion of investment to increase housing supply since the start of this Parliament to ultimately unlock over 1 million new homes. And of course, honourable members will know how committed this government is to the supply of affordable housing. I think every single member has referenced that, and that's why through our £11.5 billion affordable homes programme, we will and we are delivering tens of thousands of affordable homes for both sale and rent. Now, if I can come on to the specific campaign or a proposal from my right honourable friend for Halton Price and Howden, I won't at this point, if he will forgive me, because I have a lot to get on the record. He has passionately advocated for new towns, and we agree that an ambitious pipeline of housing and regeneration opportunities is crucial. I, of course, am a representative of a new town, Redditch, which currently houses about 70,000 people, so I know how successful and how important these developments can be. And that's one of the reasons why we're already supporting delivery at scale, along the lines that he's suggesting, through several funds, including the Garden Communities Programme, which will support the delivery of over 300,000 homes by 2050. And most of these are in the North, in the Midlands and the South West. Just to pick out a couple of examples. One is Holsneed Garden Village in Knowsley. That will deliver over 1,600 new homes in Merseyside, along with new businesses. And another example, West Carclave Garden Village. That will support up to 1,500 new homes in an innovative, sustainable new community that promotes the health and well-being of its residents. And of course, my right honourable friend from Chelmsford has referenced the fantastic development in her local area, and I look forward to continuing active discussions with her on her proposals in her bill. But of course, we must also work to unlock large, complex sites through initiatives like our Housing Infrastructure Fund, which I know my honourable friend from Carlisle has welcomed in his area. And that delivers infrastructure needed to ensure new communities are well connected and supported by local amenities. On the point of new towns, as my right honourable friend rightly asserted, they can deliver high-quality, sustainable urban development and make an important contribution to housing supply. But they require considerable resources and coordination. They require a long-term vision or master plan, strong local support, enabling infrastructure, and a significant capacity and capability commitment that is often beyond the abilities of some local authorities. So the government believes that for all these reasons, new towns can form part, but not the whole solution to alleviating housing demand. And they should be considered alongside regeneration opportunities to make the most efficient use of brownfield land and maximise the benefits of existing transport infrastructure. And in fact, all of our reforms are based on the principle that we will only deliver housing with the consent of communities and elected representatives at all levels, because we know that wherever development takes place, local people will express the same concern. So we have to get it right. And I will give way.
Grateful for to the Minister. I wonder if she would, at this point, just like to address the issue that a number of us have raised about the removal of hard targets and the uncertainty that that creates, particularly for the industry. So, for example, as she will know, the gearing up to deliver 300,000 homes a year is a huge logistical exercise requiring massive capital investment to produce bricks and building machines, all sorts of stuff. That requires a very long horizon of certainty of delivery. If there aren't any targets, how is she going to give that certainty to industry?
Yes, my right honourable friend will hopefully hear my remarks later on in my speech. And unfortunately, I can't do justice to all of the questions that have been posed to me, but I do want to just touch first on an issue of the importance of a healthy and diverse housing market, including SME builders, rightly referenced by my honourable friend for Northampton South. I would just like to make the House aware that we've launched the Levelling Up Home Building Fund, which provides £1.5 billion in development finance to SMEs and MMC builders. And in our Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, we make changes to the planning system that will make it much easier for SMEs to operate. And on the planning system, of course, every member, I think, has spoken about the importance of a modern, responsive and transparent planning system. And I think it's absolutely vital that our reformed planning system will help to bring certainty to communities and developers. And that will enable them to take those positive steps towards building more housing, regenerating their local areas and supporting economic growth. And on the point that my right honourable friend has challenged me on, he will know that we have just concluded a consultation on the NPPF. A number of these policy questions are live, and the government will respond as quickly as possible to provide that certainty to the market and to local authorities. But it is a huge consultation. It's important that we get it right. Very briefly.
Does the Minister believe that actually building 35 homes, first homes for first-time buyers, is sufficient? Is it ambitious?
I'm very proud of the government's record of building homes for affordable homes and homes for young people. And I am now aware that I need to conclude my remarks. So I just want to reiterate my huge thanks to the my right honourable friend, the member for Halton Price and Howden. He's absolutely right to so powerfully articulate the case for driving up housing supply, and that is our ambition, to build the homes this country needs, and working with members on all sides of this House, that is what this Conservative government will achieve.
David Davis to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The extraordinary importance of this issue is measured by the sheer number of people here, and not just the quantity but the quality. We've had ministerial experience, local government experience, professional experience, even APPG chair experience across the board. What's also been notable, I deliberately wrote the title as wide as possible, new housing supply. We've had complete unity in terms of the aim of closing that gap of supply, and we've had a massive multiplicity of ideas, frankly, all of which are necessary. If we're going to deliver a proper property-owning democracy to the next generation, then we have to use everything we've heard today. And I want to thank everybody for their contributions, Madam Deputy Speaker.